A billionaire surrounded by bodyguards, security systems, and lawyers, yet the only person standing between her and a kidnapping team was the quiet man in a dark jacket who drove her to meetings and never once asked for a thank you. One evening outside a luxury hotel, while trained guards vanished and radios went dead, Logan Mercer stepped forward with something no one expected, and everything changed. If you've ever believed that the most dangerous people in the room are the ones nobody notices, stay with this story until the very end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling for 3 hours before it finally stopped pretending to be gentle. By 7:45 that evening, the streets outside the Harrington Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago were slick and black, and the city's amber streetlights reflected off the pavement in long, broken columns. Delivery trucks groaned past on Michigan Avenue. A couple argued quietly under an awning across the street. The doorman in his gold-trimmed coat stood under the hotel's entrance canopy and checked his phone for the 4th time in 10 minutes, looking bored in the way that people who are paid to look alert always eventually look bored. Logan Mercer sat behind the wheel of a black Mercedes Maybach GLS and watched all of it. Not because he was anxious, not because anything felt wrong, not yet. It was simply what he did. He watched, he cataloged. He noted the truck that had been idling in the same spot on Wabash for 12 minutes now, the kind of stillness that didn't fit the rhythm of a working vehicle. He noticed the doorman's shoes. Expensive, not standard issue, a detail that wasn't a detail until it was. He registered the absence of the second security camera's blinking red indicator above the main entrance. Active cameras blinked. That one had stopped 4 minutes ago. He pressed his fingers lightly against the steering wheel and said nothing. The Harrington Grand was the kind of hotel that cost $400 a night for a standard room and looked exactly like what it was, right? A monument to the pretense that money made a person safer. 2,000 thread count sheets, private elevator access. A security team that wore earpieces and expensive suits and had, in Logan's assessment, been properly trained about 7 years ago and had coasted on muscle memory ever since. He knew this because he paid attention to these things. He always had. Isabella Sterling was inside at a private dinner, seated at a corner table in the Harrington's 42nd floor restaurant with 4 investment partners and 2 attorneys, closing a deal that had taken 11 months to negotiate. The acquisition of a European data security firm. Logan didn't know the specifics, didn't ask, didn't need to. His job was to be outside the building at 9 o'clock sharp when Isabella texted the single word ready, and to have the car warm, the rear door already unlatched, and the fastest route to her penthouse apartment already loaded. That was the job. He was good at the job. He checked the mirror again. The truck on Wabash hadn't moved. Logan picked up his phone and scrolled through nothing, the way people do when they're not actually reading. His daughter Emma had sent him a voice message at 5:30. He'd listened to it twice during the drive over. She was staying with her babysitter, Mrs. Patrice, from 3 floors down, and the message was 32 seconds of Emma explaining, at significant volume, that Mrs. Patrice had let her have 2 scoops of ice cream for dinner and she hoped that was okay, and also she'd finished her math homework, and also she loved him. Bye. He texted back a thumbs up emoji and then, after a moment, added the words, proud of you, because Emma was the kind of kid who needed to hear it, and Logan was the kind of man who needed to get better at saying it out loud. He set the phone face down on the passenger seat. 8:53, 7 minutes. The second camera's light was still dark. He pressed his lips together and looked at the lobby entrance again. Different now. The doorman was gone, not stepped inside, not moved to the side. Gone. The gold-trimmed coat was just absent, the way a tooth goes missing when you stop paying attention. The 2 hotel security men who had been positioned just inside the glass doors were no longer visible through the glass. Logan sat very still. His right hand moved to the door handle, slowly, without drama, the way a man reaches for something he's done 1,000 times before. He didn't open it yet. He watched. 3 seconds, 5 seconds. He counted the lights in the lobby and tracked the movement of the cleaning staff visible through the side windows. Still there, still normal, pushing a cart in the direction of the elevator bank. Then the 3 black SUVs turned onto Michigan Avenue from the south. They weren't speeding. That was the first thing. People always imagined that something terrible announced itself with screaming engines and squealing tires. These three vehicles moved at exactly 25 miles per hour in a tight, evenly spaced formation, and that deliberate slowness was what made Logan's entire body go cold. Fast was panic. This was planning. He was out of the car before the lead SUV reached the hotel entrance. Not running, walking. Quickly and directly, the way a man moves when he doesn't want anyone to look twice at him. He crossed the pavement in 8 steps and pushed through the side entrance, the service entrance around the corner from the main lobby, which he'd identified the first time he ever drove Isabella here, and which he'd logged away in the back of his mind the way he logged away everything, the way 12 years of military habit had permanently rewired the part of his brain that handled spatial environments. The lobby was wrong. He saw it the moment he came through. The front desk had one clerk visible, a young woman who was staring at the main entrance with her hands pressed flat on the counter, not moving. The security kiosk beside the elevator bank was empty. Not just empty, the stool was knocked sideways. A lobby phone handset was hanging from its cord, swaying slightly. Someone had cleared this floor fast. Logan moved to the elevator and hit the button for 42. His phone buzzed. Isabella. The text read, "Dinner running over. Maybe 15 more minutes," and then, 3 seconds later, "Actually, there's something weird. The restaurant staff just—" The message cut off mid-sentence. He was already moving. He took the stairs for the last 4 floors. Not because the elevators were compromised. He didn't know that yet. But because elevators put you in a box with one door and no options, and Logan Mercer had been in enough situations to know that options were the only currency that actually mattered when things went badly. He pushed through the stairwell door on 42 and came out into a carpeted hallway that was completely silent in a way hotel hallways never were. Hotels always hummed ice machines, distant conversations, the low rumble of HVAC systems. This hallway was the wrong kind of quiet. He moved past a housekeeping cart that had been abandoned with towels still folded on the top shelf. The restaurant was at the far end. Glass walls, city view, the kind of place where the menu didn't list prices. He could see figures through the glass. Movement. Too many people moving at once in the jerky, uncertain way that meant nobody was in charge of their own body right now. He eased the door open 4 inches. The private dining room connected to the main restaurant through a frosted glass partition. 4 men in black tactical gear, balaclava masks, gloves, no visible insignia on anything, had the room secured with a competence that told Logan everything he needed to know about who had sent them. These were not random criminals. They moved with the practiced economy of people who had done this specific kind of work before. 2 covered the exits. One had his attention on the investment partners and attorneys who were on their knees beside the table with their hands raised and their faces arranged in the various configurations of absolute terror. The 4th man, the one who seemed to be in charge, was standing in front of Isabella. She was still in her chair. That surprised him. And it told him something. She hadn't gone to her knees. The chair was turned away from the table, so she was facing the man directly, and her hands were on the armrests, not raised, not compliant. The posture of someone who was terrified but absolutely refused to show it, or possibly wasn't terrified, just furious. Logan had driven her for 14 months, and he wouldn't have bet against either one. The man in charge was speaking to her in a low voice, not shouting. This wasn't a robbery. There was no demand, no spreading of people across the floor, no collection of wallets and phones. They'd already collected everyone's phones in a small pile on the table. Isabella's phone wasn't in the pile. Logan registered this. She'd texted him after they entered, which meant she'd hidden the phone before they got to her. They were here for her specifically. Everyone else was irrelevant. Logan pulled the door back quietly and took 3 slow breaths. He was 42 floors above street level in a hotel that had been compromised from the inside by people who had coordinated a sophisticated multi-point operation to abduct one specific person. He was wearing dark slacks and a jacket. He had no weapon except a tactical folding knife in his inside pocket that he'd carried every single day since leaving the Navy, the same way some men carried a lucky coin. He was one person. He had done more with less. He thought about Emma for exactly 1 second. The voice message, the ice cream, the "I love you, bye." And then he set the thought down completely, the way he'd trained himself to do years ago. Because thinking about the thing you were protecting was the fastest way to make a mistake when protecting it mattered most. He assessed the room geometry. 1 door in from the hallway. Fire exit on the south wall, currently covered by the man nearest it. The frosted glass partition between the main restaurant floor and the private room had a gap at the far end where the partition met the wall, approximately 18 inches. The man with his back partially to Logan was positioned between the investment partners and the exit. The tactical leader was focused entirely on Isabella. Logan pushed the door open and walked into the restaurant. Normally. Not creeping, not rushing, just walking, the way a man walks when he belongs in a room. He moved to the nearest table and picked up a water glass and kept moving. He was 4 steps into the space before one of the perimeter men clocked him and started to bring his radio up. Logan threw the water glass, not at the man, past him, into the frosted glass partition, which shattered with a sound like a gunshot in the confined space. Every head in the room turned toward the sound. Logan was already moving. What happened in the next 40 seconds was not elegant. It was not clean. It was not the kind of thing that looked the way action sequences looked in movies, where everything moved in satisfying arcs and nobody ever got hurt in ways that were inconvenient. Logan took a knee strike to the ribs from the nearest man before he'd fully closed the distance, and something compressed in his chest that would hurt for 2 weeks. He got the man's radio arm locked and used the man's own momentum to put him into the table, and the table went over with a crash of crystal and silverware and a sound that made the attorneys flinch hard enough to fall sideways. The second perimeter man came around the partition fast, and Logan had maybe a second and a half to work with, which was enough for a palm strike that snapped the man's head back and sat him down on the floor. But Logan's hand rang with it and 3 of his knuckles split. The man by the fire exit was bringing something up from his waistband when Isabella Sterling threw her chair. She stood up from it. Just stood up, hard and fast, the way someone stands when they've decided, and grabbed the back and swung it sideways into the man's forearm before he completed the draw. The chair connected with a solid, ugly crack, and the man stumbled. It wasn't a perfect throw. It wasn't a trained strike. It caught the man off balance more than it hurt him, but it bought Logan the 1 second he needed to close the distance and take the weapon out of the equation entirely. The tactical leader grabbed Isabella's arm. She didn't scream. She said, very clearly in a voice that was almost conversational, "Don't." He yanked her backward anyway. Logan crossed the room in 4 steps and introduced the heel of his right hand to the man's nose with enough force to make the cartilage decision final, and the grip on Isabella's arm came loose, and the man went down sideways against the wall and stayed there, making a sound like a man reconsidering his life choices. 38 seconds. The room was very quiet. Isabella stood in the wreckage of the private dining room. Overturned furniture, broken crystal on the carpet, 4 men in various states of horizontal, and looked at Logan. Really looked at him. The way she had not looked at him in 14 months of him holding open car doors and saying, "Good morning, Miss Sterling," and navigating Chicago traffic without comment. Her face was not what he'd expected. He'd expected shock or relief, or the particular expression of someone processing something enormous. She looked focused. She looked like she was running calculations. She said, "You just disarmed a professional kidnapping team." Logan checked the nearest man, found his wrists, and secured them with the man's own zip ties from his vest pocket. He said, "We need to move. There are more of them in the building." "How do you know that?" "Because there are always more of them in the building." He moved to the next man. 3 SUVs outside, 4 men up here. That's not the whole operation." He looked up at her. "Is there anyone in your security detail still on this floor?" She blinked once. "My personal security team. They were supposed to be stationed on 40. James, my head of security. He didn't come up with me tonight. He said the building team had the floor covered." Logan was quiet for exactly half a second. "James gave you the security briefing for tonight personally?" "Yes." "And he specifically said the building team had 42 covered?" "Yes." She was watching him. "Why?" Logan stood up. "Because that means whoever sent these men had access to your itinerary and your security protocol, which means your head of security either made an error or he's involved." Her voice was flat, not devastated, flat, in the way that people go flat when something clicks into place that they'd been refusing to let click. She'd been running a billion-dollar company since she was 26 years old. She knew what betrayal looked like in a spreadsheet. The human version was a different calculation, but she wasn't slow. She picked up her phone from where she'd tucked it in her jacket pocket. I need to call. Not yet. He was already moving to the fire exit. The people you'd normally call may not be the right people to call right now. Come with me. She didn't argue. Bad. The service stairwell behind the fire exit smelled like cleaning chemicals and old concrete, and their footsteps on the metal stairs made more noise than Logan would have liked. He kept 2 steps ahead and listened for sounds below. Voices, radios, the particular cadence of men moving as a unit in an enclosed space. 3 floors down, he stopped and put his arm out, and she stopped behind him without being asked. Footsteps. 2 sets. Rising. He pulled her back through the door at 39, and they moved down the hallway in the opposite direction, past a housekeeping closet, locked, and a linen storage room. The lock had a standard hotel master keypad, and Logan punched in a 4-digit sequence. Isabella opened her mouth, and he shook his head once, and she closed it. The linen room was small and warm and smelled like detergent. You knew that code, she said quietly. It's the default factory code for this lock model. Most hotels never change it. She absorbed this. How do you know things like that? I used to have a job where knowing things like that kept people alive. He was already at his phone, not calling, texting, a number she couldn't see. I'm reaching out to someone I trust, someone outside your company and outside the normal channels. Who? A former colleague. He looked up. You're going to have to decide in the next 30 seconds whether you trust me. Isabella Sterling had built her company on the ability to read people, not because she was naive enough to think she was always right, but because she'd gotten good enough at it to know the difference between a man performing trustworthiness and a man simply being it. She'd been watching Logan Mercer for 14 months. She'd clocked his patience, his precision, the particular stillness of someone who was always paying attention. She'd attributed it to good professional temperament. She understood now that she'd been looking at something else entirely. I trust you, she said. Tell me what you need me to do. Logan nodded once. Not with relief, not with the slight softening that people showed when they were reassured. Just a nod, the way a person acknowledges a piece of information that changes the plan. He went back to the phone. I need you to think carefully, he said while he typed. The dinner tonight, who knew about it? The full guest list, the venue, the time. Not your assistant, not your security team. Who made the original booking? She thought. Richard Hale, my acting chairman. A pause. He suggested the Harrington specifically, 4 weeks ago. Logan's jaw tightened slightly. It was a small movement, and she might have missed it, but she didn't. And the board meeting you have scheduled? Thursday, she said. A vote on the Nexus acquisition. The vote transfers majority decision-making authority to the board for the next quarter while I'm in Europe for the rollout. If you're incapacitated or unreachable before Thursday, the vote proceeds by proxy. Richard chairs it. Her voice had gone very quiet. And if the acquisition passes by proxy, the board gains access to the full Nexus asset package, which includes... She stopped. Which includes what? Logan asked. She looked at him, and for the first time since he'd walked through that restaurant door, something crossed her face that was not calculation or cold focus. It was something more frightened, something that recognized the scale of what she was looking at. It includes proprietary cybersecurity architecture worth approximately $4 billion, she said. Government contracts, infrastructure vulnerabilities for 14 different allied nations, defensive systems that, in the wrong hands, could be reverse engineered into... She pressed her lips together. This isn't corporate espionage. This is something much worse. The hallway outside the linen room was quiet. Logan finished his text and looked at her steadily. Then we need to move faster. The underground maintenance level of the Harrington Grand ran beneath the entire block, connecting to the hotel's service infrastructure and through an older utility corridor that had been in the building's original 1962 construction to a secondary access point beneath the parking structure 200 feet to the east. Logan knew this because he had made a habit, for the past 14 months, of learning the buildings that Isabella Sterling entered regularly. He'd never mentioned this to her. He'd never expected to need it. He needed it now. The utility corridor was low-ceilinged and lit with industrial fluorescent strips, and it smelled like every basement in Chicago. that specific combination of moisture and old concrete and something faintly electrical. Their footsteps were quieter down here, and the sound absorbed into the walls. Water pipes ran along the ceiling. A junction box marked service only occupied a niche to the left. The corridor bent twice before it opened into the parking structure's maintenance bay, and Logan moved through it with a surety that he recognized as muscle memory from 1,000 drills in 1,000 places that looked exactly like this. Isabella stayed close. She didn't fill the silence with questions, which he respected. At the first bend in the corridor, they found the man. He was propped against the wall with his wrists bound behind him and a strip of duct tape across his mouth, and he was conscious but barely. One eye beginning to swell, uniform torn at the collar. A hotel security badge. His name tag read Pete Vargas. He looked at them with the focused, desperate alertness of someone who had been waiting to be found. Logan was kneeling beside him in 3 seconds, pulling the tape back carefully. Pete Vargas sucked in a breath and coughed. "They hit us at 7:15, he said, voice rough. 4 of us on the security rotation. They took us down one by one. They knew the schedule, they knew who was where. Radios were jammed." He looked at Logan. "How many are there?" "I cleared 4 on 42. At least 2 more in the stairwells. I don't know the full number yet." Logan checked the zip ties on his wrists, standard commercial grade. He pulled the folding knife from his jacket. "Your radio?" "They took it. My phone, too." Vargas winced as the zip ties came loose. "There's a landline in the maintenance bay. Emergency line. Goes straight to CPD dispatch. Bypasses the hotel switchboard." "Is it likely compromised?" "Shouldn't be. It's hardwired into the city grid, not the hotel's comm system. They'd have had to know about it specifically." Logan looked at Isabella. She shook her head. She didn't know about it, which meant whoever planned this likely didn't either. "Can you walk?" Logan asked Vargas. "Yeah, Nate." The man flexed his hands and got his feet under him with some difficulty. "You know what you're doing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Not always," Logan said. He stood up and looked at both of them. "We move together. We get to the landline, we call CPD, we stay in place until units arrive and I can verify badges. Does that work?" Vargas nodded. Isabella said, "It works." They moved. The maintenance bay was dim and utilitarian. Vehicles at the far end, equipment lockers, the concrete pillars of the parking structure visible through a chain-link partition. The landline was on the wall beside the emergency kit. Vargas got to it first and dialed while Logan positioned himself at the only entry point and watched the corridor they'd come from. Isabella stood in the center of the bay and thought. He could see her doing it, the particular stillness of someone running scenarios, mapping consequences, building a picture of something she hadn't wanted to see. She had her phone in her hand and was looking at it without unlocking the screen. "James was with the company for 6 years, she said. Not loudly. More like she was laying it down somewhere. Logan didn't answer. He was the best I'd ever had. Reliable, thorough. I trusted him with everything. The schedule, the protocols, the route information, all of it." She paused. "I brought him in personally." "People make choices," Logan said, still watching the corridor. "The choice doesn't have anything to do with you. It has everything to do with me. I'm the one who misjudged. You hired him. You can't control what he decides to do with the position after that." He glanced at her briefly. "If you want to do the self-examination later, do it later. Right now I need you focused." She looked at him. "You're a blunt man." "I've been told." "I assumed you were just quiet." "I'm quiet when there's nothing worth saying." Something almost moved across her face that might have been a different moment, been amusement. It settled into something more measured. She unlocked her phone. "I need to contact my legal team. If Richard Hale moves on Thursday's vote before we can... Hold on that for now. If anyone in your internal network has been compromised, a contact to your legal team tonight could be flagged." Logan kept his eyes on the corridor. "Vargas, how long on CPD?" "Dispatch said 8 minutes, Vargas said, one hand still on the landline. 2 units. Tell them we need plain clothes or dark vehicles. If there are additional crew outside monitoring the scene, marked units will alert them." Vargas relayed this without questioning it. Isabella was watching Logan with an expression he couldn't fully read and didn't try to. "You're not just a driver," she said. I was for a while, he said. Before what? He was quiet for a moment, and the sound of a distant siren starting up somewhere filtered through the concrete above them. Before I needed to be something else, he said. It wasn't an answer. And she knew it wasn't an answer, and he knew she knew, and neither of them addressed this, because there was a time and a space for that conversation, and this was not it. And Logan Mercer had long since made peace with the fact that some explanations lived on the other side of emergencies. He turned back to this corridor and watched the dark mouth of it for movement, while, above them, the Harrington Grand Hotel began the complicated institutional process of realizing something had gone wrong tonight in ways that would take weeks to fully understand. The sirens got closer. The first CPD units came in unmarked and quiet, 2 plainclothes detectives flanking a 4-person tactical response element, and Logan watched badge numbers and verified against an independent database on his phone before he moved away from the entry point. Old habit. In 12 years of operational work, the worst compromises he'd seen were the ones where people assumed that a badge meant safety. He did this quietly, standing slightly to the side, and Isabella noticed and said nothing. When the senior detective, a compact woman with gray-streaked hair named Reyes, who moved with the specific economy of someone who had been doing this for 20 years, took Logan's brief and looked at him for 3 seconds in a way that told him she was reassessing something, he met her eyes and held them. Former SEAL, he said preemptively. I know how that sounds. You can verify with Commander Dan Harwick at Naval Special Warfare Command. He'll answer tonight. He gave her a number. She looked at him for another second. Then she nodded and moved on. Isabella was watching from 6 feet away. Logan holstered his phone and looked at her for a moment. She had a scrape along her left forearm from when the chair had clipped her, and her jacket was torn at the shoulder. She'd fixed her hair at some point in the maintenance bay, not out of vanity. He understood it was the kind of habitual self-organization that some people engaged in when they were managing fear, making order where order was possible. He respected that. She looked like she had something to say. The board meeting is Thursday, she said. Richard Hale will be at that table with a legal team and a proxy motion ready to go. We have tonight's operation, the evidence chain from 4 individuals in custody, and presumably their comms and coordination records. Logan looked at her steadily. That's enough to establish conspiracy. Your legal team will move for injunctive relief before morning. If the conspiracy goes as deep as it might, then it goes as deep as it goes, he said. That's what investigators are for. You don't have to solve it tonight. She looked at him for a long moment. You pulled me out of that room. You secured the corridor, found a secured communication line, verified the responding officers, and you're now telling me what's legally actionable by morning. She paused. Who are you? Logan was quiet for a moment. Not the practiced quiet of someone avoiding a question, the shorter, more genuine quiet of someone figuring out how honest to be. I'm your driver, he said. You're not just my driver. I used to be more, he said. I chose not to be anymore. He looked away toward the corridor. I made a choice about what kind of life I wanted to give my daughter. That hasn't changed. He turned back. Tonight was... He paused, and something crossed his face that was neither pride nor regret. Something more honest than either. Tonight was necessary. She didn't push it. Somewhere above them, the Harrington Grand was full of uniformed officers, and the first confused wave of media vehicles would be arriving on Michigan Avenue. An operation that had been months in the planning was unraveling in real time around the people who had built it, and 4 men were in custody who knew the names of the people who sent them, and those names were already beginning their slow, inevitable movement toward the light. But down here in the maintenance bay, Isabella Sterling stood next to her driver in a torn jacket with a scraped arm, and the things she was feeling, beneath the calculations and the threat assessments and the 10 things she was already thinking about for tomorrow, was something simpler and harder to name. The feeling of having been seen as the specific person you were, in the worst moment you'd been in, by someone who was under no obligation to care and had cared anyway. She would understand later that this was the moment she started to understand what she'd been missing. Right now, she looked at Logan and said, "Thank you." He looked at her for a brief second. He said, "Don't lose the phone. You might need to send that text again sometime." And then Detective Reyes called him over, and Logan Mercer walked toward the voice of the woman with the badge. And he was already thinking about what Emma's face would look like in the morning when he picked her up from Mrs. Patrice's apartment, and she told him about the ice cream, and he would tell her nothing about tonight because some things you carried alone, and he had always been very good at carrying. 300 feet above the maintenance bay, in the wreckage of the Harrington's 42nd floor private dining room, a tactical radio crackled once and went silent. 4 men who had been hired by serious people with serious money to do a specific job had not completed that job. The person who had hired them would know this within the hour. What they would not yet know, what would become clear over the days that followed, as phone records and financial transfers and security footage began to be examined by people who were very good at their work, was that the failure of the operation had left something behind. Not just evidence, a thread. And in Logan Mercer's experience, which was considerable, threads never stayed unexamined. Not when the right people started pulling. Detective Reyes kept Logan for 40 minutes. She was thorough in the way that good investigators were thorough. Not aggressive, not theatrical, just methodical and patient, circling back to the same points from different angles, watching his face when the answers came. Logan gave her everything she needed in the sequence she needed it, and he kept his language clean and factual, the way he'd been trained to report in environments where imprecise language cost lives. He told her about the camera, the doorman's absence, the 3 SUVs. He told her about the timing, the room geometry, the zip ties from the tactical vest. He told her he'd secured 4 individuals and that 2 of them would need medical attention before transport. She asked him twice about his current occupation, and he told her twice. Personal driver, Sterling Cyber Solutions, 14 months. She wrote this down both times and said nothing about the gap between the job title and what he had described doing in that restaurant. When she finally let him go, it was past 11, and the lobby of the Harrington was a contained chaos of uniforms, hotel management in various states of distress, and 2 men from the FBI field office who had arrived 20 minutes earlier and were engaged in the particular territorial negotiation that happened whenever CPD and federal jurisdiction overlapped on something that was clearly going to become federal jurisdiction. Logan moved through all of it without engaging and found Isabella on the far side of the lobby near the concierge desk, sitting in an armchair with a hotel first aid attendant wrapping the scrape on her forearm. She was on her phone. From the clipped precision of her voice, she was talking to her attorney. He stood nearby and waited. She finished the call and looked at him. The first aid attendant gathered his kit and moved away. "Marcus Chen," she said. "My personal attorney. He's already filed for an emergency injunction against any proxy votes or board actions pending the outcome of the investigation." She paused. He said it was the fastest he'd ever been called in his life. "Good. Richard Hale hasn't been reached yet. His phone is going to voicemail." She looked at her wrapped forearm and then at Logan. "James Kowalski, my head of security. His home address shows he hasn't been there for 3 days. Neighbor says he packed a bag." Logan said nothing. She hadn't expected him to. "The 4 men in custody," she said. "CPD ran preliminary IDs. 2 of them have prior military records. 1 has a history in private security contracts in Eastern Europe." She looked up at him. "These were not people you hire on short notice." "No," he agreed. "This was planned over months, minimum. Which means someone inside my company has been feeding information to whoever contracted this team for at least that long." She closed her eyes briefly, 1 second, 2, and then opened them, and whatever she'd done in that small interval had reorganized something in her face. "I need to understand everything, not just what happened tonight. All of it." She looked at him steadily. "And I think you're the only person in my proximity right now whose judgment I can fully trust." Logan looked at her for a moment. He thought about the drive home, about Emma at Mrs. Patrice's apartment sleeping through all of this, about the fact that his ribs ached every time he breathed too deeply, and he had not mentioned this to anyone. "All right," he said. "Tell me about Nexus." They used a conference room on the hotel's 3rd floor that the CPD had cleared and released back to the building's management. It was a generic corporate space, oval table, wall screen, the particular fluorescent light quality that made everyone look like they hadn't slept. A hotel employee brought coffee without being asked, left it, and disappeared. Isabella sat across from Logan with a legal pad that she'd borrowed from the concierge desk and a pen that had the hotel's name on it, and she talked for 20 minutes straight while Logan listened. Nexus Data Solutions was a German-headquartered cybersecurity firm that Sterling Cyber had been acquiring in a deal that had been publicly disclosed 8 months ago. On the surface, it was a straightforward acquisition. Nexus had excellent penetration testing protocols, a European client base that complemented Sterling's North American focus, and a research division that had developed what the industry press described, in the cautious language that the industry always used, as significant advances in critical infrastructure protection. What the industry press did not know, what almost nobody outside the relevant government agencies and Isabella's innermost circle knew, was that the Nexus Research Division had built something more specific than infrastructure protection. They had built a comprehensive mapping system, a digital atlas of vulnerabilities in the critical infrastructure of 14 NATO-aligned nations, not to exploit those vulnerabilities, but to document them, so that the nations involved could patch them before adversarial actors found them first. Power grids, water treatment systems, communications networks, financial clearing infrastructure, the kind of systems that, if attacked in coordinated sequence, could reduce a modern nation to something resembling 1975 within 72 hours. The mapping data lived in Nexus's research archive. When the acquisition closed, that archive would transfer to Sterling Cyber under a classified contractual framework that had taken 11 months to negotiate with multiple government agencies on both sides of the Atlantic. Isabella was the designated custodian. The whole arrangement depended on her being in control of her company. If the board took proxy control before Thursday's vote, and if the Nexus acquisition proceeded through that proxy, which it legally could, the board's majority vote being sufficient under the company's charter, the archive would transfer to an entity that was no longer unambiguously under Isabella's control. In the wrong hands, or more precisely, in the hands of someone willing to sell access to the wrong people, what was inside that archive was not a cybersecurity asset. It was a map of how to bring down the Western world's essential infrastructure. Isabella finished and looked at Logan. She'd been precise and organized in the telling, but the precision was doing a lot of work, and he could see underneath it the particular exhaustion of someone who had been carrying something large for a very long time. How many people inside your company knew the full scope of what Nexus contained? He asked. 3, she counted. Myself, my general counsel, Patricia Ewan, who I've known since graduate school and who is currently in Geneva, and she stopped. Her jaw tightened once. And Richard Hale, who I brought onto the board personally, who I gave a board seat to because I trusted him. And your head of security? James knew the acquisition was sensitive. He knew there was government involvement. He didn't know the specifics of the archive. A pause. Although if Hale had access to my office files, which he did as acting chairman, he could have briefed James independently. Logan turned his coffee cup in his hands. The people who hired this team tonight, they're not domestic actors. No, her voice was flat. The kind of money required to contract a team like that, coordinate an operation of this complexity, and have someone inside a company at this level, that's state-level resources or very well-funded private interests with state-level connections. Which means tonight was an extraction attempt, Logan said. Not a kidnapping for ransom. They needed you to be unreachable before Thursday, incapacitated, hospitalized, or worse, and they needed it to look like a criminal incident rather than a corporate action. So that by Thursday morning, the board moves, the vote passes, and by the time anyone understands what actually happened, the acquisition is legally complete and the archive access belongs to whoever Hale is working for. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. And I'm the only person who can contest it. Without me present and legally competent to challenge the proxy motion, the whole thing goes through. Logan set his coffee down. Which is why they needed you specifically. This was never about money. It was about removing you from the equation before the deadline. The fluorescent light hummed overhead. Isabella was looking at him with an expression that had moved past the cold focus of someone managing a crisis and into something more personal and harder to categorize. How do you know how to think about this? She asked. The operational logic, the way you're mapping it. Logan was quiet for a moment. He'd known this conversation was coming. He'd been calculating since the maintenance bay whether it would happen tonight or whether he could defer it, and he understood now that he couldn't. "Before I drove your car," he said, "I spent 12 years in the Navy." He looked at her directly. SEAL teams. Specifically, a unit that specialized in high-value target recovery and executive protection in hostile environments. She absorbed this without visibly reacting. How high value? Ambassadors. Intelligence assets? Occasionally defense contractors in situations that didn't make the news. He looked at his hands. Toward the end, my team ran a series of operations in locations I can't name that were specifically about interdicting exactly this kind of thing. Coordinated attacks on protected individuals tied to sensitive asset transfers. He paused. I was very good at it. Why did you stop? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Logan took his time with it. Not because he was deciding whether to answer, he'd already decided, but because some things required the courtesy of being said properly. 2 reasons, he said. The first was my team. He looked at the table. We ran an operation in the 3rd year. I was 28. That went wrong in ways that I couldn't have prevented and couldn't stop replaying. I lost 3 men I'd been with for 6 years. That does something to you. It doesn't end you, but it changes the geometry of everything. He was quiet for a moment. The second reason was my daughter. Isabella waited. Emma was born while I was on a deployment I can't describe in a country I can't name, he said. I came home when she was 11 days old. Her mother, Claire, held Emma up and said, "She has your stubbornness and my common sense, which means she's going to be fine." A pause. The kind that lives in a specific place. Claire was sick by the time Emma was 2, leukemia. We didn't know until it had already been moving for a while. He looked up. She died when Emma was 4. I was home for that. I'd already started the process of separating from the Navy because Claire made me promise, and I kept that promise. After she was gone, it was Emma and me. The room was very quiet. I needed to be ordinary, he said. I needed to be the kind of father who drove a car and came home every night and made breakfast on Saturday mornings and helped with math homework. Emma needed that from me more than anything else in the world, and I needed to give it to her. He looked at Isabella. So I drove. And I was good at that too. Different kind of good, but good. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. You never told me any of this. It wasn't relevant to the job. It's a little relevant now. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at the legal pad in front of her. She'd stopped writing 10 minutes ago. How old is Emma? 10. She's a good kid. Better than I deserve, probably. He said this without self-pity, just as a statement of fact that he'd made some private peace with. She's at my neighbor's tonight. She thinks I'm working late. You are working late. I'm working late, he agreed. Isabella almost smiled. It didn't quite make it to her face, but it came close. I'm sorry, she said. About your wife. And your team. Thank you. He said it simply, without deflection. Claire had been gone for 6 years, and he'd learned that accepting condolences gracefully was one of the harder skills that nobody trained you for. It was a long time ago, and it was also yesterday, depending on the morning. She nodded. She understood the math of that. He could tell. I need to ask you something, he said, and I need you to be honest with me, even if the honest answer is uncomfortable. All right. The Nexus deal. The classified framework. The government agencies involved. Have you documented your custodian designation anywhere outside of your legal team and the relevant government contacts? She thought. The designation is in the acquisition agreement, notarized, held by Marcus Chen's firm and by the Federal Liaison Office. She paused. And in a sealed document I filed with a private archive service 18 months ago, when the framework was first being negotiated. A precaution. Does anyone outside of those parties know about the sealed document? She started to answer and then stopped. Her expression shifted slightly. The specific quality of someone who has just registered something they don't want to have registered. Patricia knew, she said. My general counsel. She recommended the archive service. A pause. And I mentioned it once to James. Not the content, just that I'd filed a precautionary document. We were discussing risk protocols and I used it as an example. She closed her eyes for 1 second. He would have told Hale. Then Hale knows there's a document, but he doesn't know its location or content. No. Then the document is intact and so is your legal designation. Logan looked at her steadily. Which means we have everything we need. The injunction your attorney filed, the designation document, and 4 men in CPD custody who were hired to prevent you from exercising that designation. He paused. This falls apart for them very fast once the legal chain is established. She breathed out slowly. Unless they move faster than Marcus can get the injunction through. How long has Marcus been your attorney? 11 years. And in 11 years, has he ever been slow when it mattered? She looked at him. No. Then trust that, Logan said. Tonight you need to let the people whose job this is do their jobs. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Gratitude and something older than gratitude. Something that looked more like the specific exhaustion of someone who had been the most capable person in every room for so long that they'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone else carry a portion of the weight, even briefly. You're a strange man, Logan Mercer, she said. So I've been told. You take down a professional kidnapping team, and then you tell me to trust my attorney. Different tools for different problems. He stood up and picked up his coffee. I'm going to go check in with Detective Reyes and see if they've moved on Hale's location. You should call Patricia. It's nearly 3 a.m. in Geneva. Yes, he said. Call her anyway. He moved toward the door and she said his name. He turned. What would have happened tonight, she said, if you hadn't noticed the camera? He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the Maybach at the curb, the rain-slick street, the amber light on the pavement, the particular stillness of a man in a car who had trained himself to notice the absence of things. Something I prefer not to think about, he said. He went through the door. In the weeks that followed, things moved the way investigations into large conspiracies moved. Not cleanly, not swiftly, but with the inexorable momentum of a heavy object that had been pushed off an edge and was now simply continuing in the direction gravity demanded. The 4 men taken into custody at the Harrington gave up their contractor within 36 hours, when it became clear to 2 of them that the contractor had no intention of providing the legal support they'd been promised. The contractor, a private security consultant operating under 3 different business names, led federal investigators to a wire transfer trail that crossed 4 international financial systems before arriving, through a series of intermediary accounts, at a source that 2 FBI analysts and 1 Treasury Department specialist described in their separate reports using the same word, sophisticated. Richard Hale was apprehended at O'Hare Airport at 6:42 in the morning, 17 hours after the Harrington incident, with a one-way business class ticket to Zurich and a carry-on bag that contained, among other items, an encrypted hard drive that forensic specialists would spend the next 3 weeks working through. He said nothing during the arrest. His attorney, who arrived 40 minutes later, said considerably more, but none of it was legally useful. James Kowalski was picked up at a rental property in suburban Milwaukee 2 days later. He sat across from federal investigators for 4 hours and did not speak a word, which was either genuine professional discipline or the behavior of a man who had understood, in the long quiet hours of those 2 days, exactly how much trouble he was in and had decided that silence was the only remaining currency he controlled. The chief security officer and 3 board members who had been part of the proxy arrangement were placed on administrative suspension pending federal review within 4 days of the incident. 2 of them immediately hired separate attorneys and began the process of negotiating cooperation agreements, the way that people who had been confident that nothing would go wrong always began negotiating when something went wrong. Isabella was not present for most of this. She was in her office, working. The board meeting on Thursday happened on schedule, with a modified quorum, with Marcus Chen seated at the table alongside a federal liaison officer, and the proxy motion was denied by a margin that was not close. The Nexus acquisition proceeded through its proper legal channels, with Isabella's custodian designation intact and documented, and the archive transferred to its intended home under the framework that 11 months of negotiation had built. She called Logan the evening of the Thursday meeting from her office at 7:45, the same time he would normally have been outside a building waiting for her text. He was home. Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, and Logan was making something approximating dinner from whatever was in the refrigerator, which was an activity he engaged in several times a week, with results that were adequate rather than inspiring. He stepped into the hallway when the call came. "It's done," Isabella said. "The vote passed. The acquisition is complete. Everything is where it should be." "Good," he said. A pause. "The FBI field office wants a formal deposition from you next week. Standard procedure for the investigation." "I know. Reyes already contacted me." "Logan." A pause that had a shape to it. "I want to say something, and I need you to let me finish before you tell me it was just the job." He leaned against the hallway wall and looked at the strip of light under Emma's door. "All right. What you did that night," she said, "wasn't just the job. I've had security professionals around me for years. People trained specifically for what happened at the Harrington, people with equipment and protocols and entire teams. None of them were there. You were there. You were there because you pay attention to things other people stop paying attention to, because 12 years of what you went through never fully left you, and because—" She paused, and when she continued, her voice had a quality that was less polished than her usual register, something more direct. "Because I think you're someone who protects people even when the job description doesn't require it. I think that's just who you are." Logan was quiet for a moment. From Emma's room, the sound of a chair scraping back from a desk, a small voice asking if dinner was ready yet. "Just a few more minutes," he called back. And then, into the phone, "I appreciate that." "That's all you're going to say?" "I'm making dinner," he said. "My daughter is waiting." Isabella made a sound that might have been a laugh, short and genuine and slightly surprised at itself. "Right," she said. "Of course." A pause. "I'll see you Monday. I'll be outside at 8, he said. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment, with the sound of Emma moving around in her room and the smell of whatever he'd left on the stove, and the particular quality of quiet that existed in a small apartment when the people in it were safe. He pushed off the wall and went back to the kitchen. "Dad," Emma said, appearing in the doorway in her socks, "is that burning?" He turned to the stove. It was not technically burning. It was aggressively browning. "It's fine," he said. "It smells like your last attempt at stir-fry." "My last attempt at stir-fry was perfectly edible." "You made me eat it twice." He looked at her. She was 10 years old and had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and the particular gift of the chronically honest, which was occasionally inconvenient and mostly something he was deeply grateful for. "Sit down," he said. "It'll be ready in 5 minutes." Emma sat at the table and picked up her pencil and looked at her homework and said, without looking up, "You seem different today." He put plates on the counter. "Different how?" She shrugged, the way 10-year-olds shrug when they know something they can't quite articulate. "Like something happened, but like you're okay." Logan stood at the stove and looked at the window above it, where the Chicago night was doing what it always did, going about its enormous and different business beyond the glass. "Something happened," he said, "but I'm okay." She nodded, satisfied, and went back to her homework. He finished making dinner. The deposition took 3 hours. Logan sat in a federal building conference room on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in the first 40 minutes, and 2 FBI agents who were thorough in the way that federal investigators were thorough, which was to say, more thorough than CPD, more patient, and considerably more interested in the parts of the story that Logan would have preferred to keep brief. The senior agent was a man named Daltrey, 40-something, with the particular flatness of expression that came from years of listening to people tell him things they wish they didn't have to say. His partner, Agent Foss, was younger and took notes on a laptop with the focused intensity of someone who had learned early that the details other people dismissed were usually the ones that mattered. They went through the Harrington incident in granular sequence. Logan gave them exactly what he'd given Reyes, in the same order, with the same language. When Daltrey circled back to the moment Logan had decided to leave the car and enter the building, he asked the question twice, once directly and once from a different angle. And Logan understood that he was being tested for consistency and gave him the same answer both times, because it was the truth, and true things didn't change shape when you rotated them. Daltrey set his pen down at one point and looked at Logan with an expression that had stepped slightly outside the professional register. "Mr. Mercer, in your assessment, were the individuals you encountered on 42 operating under orders to use lethal force if necessary?" Logan considered this. The team leader's posture suggested restraint around Ms. Sterling specifically. The others, I wouldn't characterize their mandate as non-lethal, meaning if someone other than Ms. Sterling had interfered, the calculus would have been different, Logan said. Yes. Daltrey looked at him for a moment. You understood that going in. I understood it was possible. And you went in anyway. Logan picked up the cold coffee and looked at it and set it back down. There wasn't a version of staying in the car that I could live with. Daltrey made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite anything else, and wrote something in his notes that Logan didn't try to read. They moved on to Richard Hale. What the federal investigation had assembled in the 10 days since the Harrington incident was, even by the standards of people who investigated corporate conspiracies for a living, considerable. Daltrey walked Logan through the relevant portions, not out of obligation, but because Logan's testimony was more useful when he understood the larger architecture it was fitting into, and Daltrey was experienced enough to know that. Richard Hale had been on Sterling Cyber's board for 4 years. He'd come in with impeccable credentials, 20 years in technology investment, board seats at 3 other successful firms, personal introductions from 2 people Isabella trusted. His integration into the company's upper structure had been gradual and unremarkable, the way that genuinely dangerous things usually were. He'd asked good questions in board meetings. He'd been supportive of Isabella's leadership in the ways that mattered publicly, and had begun, 18 months ago, to quietly build relationships with 3 other board members who shared, as it turned out, a specific set of financial concerns about the company's direction. The encrypted hard drive recovered from his carry-on at O'Hare had taken federal forensic specialists 12 days to partially crack, and what they'd found inside was, in Daltrey's measured language, consistent with a sustained effort to facilitate unauthorized access to proprietary national security assets. In plainer terms, Hale had been in contact with a brokerage network, not a government directly, but a private intelligence intermediary that operated in the space between state-level interests and commercial contractors, for at least 14 months. He'd been providing them with detailed intelligence on the Nexus acquisition timeline, the classified framework structure, and Isabella's personal security protocols. James Kowalski had broken his silence on day 4. Not dramatically. He'd asked for a meeting with federal prosecutors and had sat across from them and spoken in a flat, careful monotone for 6 hours, the way a man spoke when he'd decided that the only remaining option was to be precisely useful. He'd confirmed that Hale had approached him 11 months ago. The offer had been money, a significant amount, and a guarantee of extraction from the country before any investigation could identify him. He'd accepted. He'd been providing Hale with Isabella's schedule, her security rotation, her communications protocols, and the layout of her regular locations for 9 months before the Harrington operation. When prosecutors asked him why, he'd said something that Daltrey relayed to Logan without editorial comment. I told myself it was just information, that I wasn't hurting anyone, that by the time anything actually happened, I'd be long gone. He'd paused in his statement. People tell themselves a lot of things. Logan sat with this for a moment when Daltrey said it. He knew the arithmetic of that particular self-deception. He'd seen it before, not in corporate settings, but in operational environments where people made incremental choices that each seemed survivable in isolation until the accumulation of them became something irreversible. The human capacity for compartmentalization was not limited to traumatized veterans. It was standard equipment. What's his cooperation status? Logan asked. Full cooperation in exchange for reduced charges, Daltrey said. He's given us the full communication chain between himself and Hale, and between Hale and the intermediary network. He paused. The network has connections to at least 2 foreign intelligence services. This is no longer purely a corporate criminal matter. Logan nodded. He'd suspected this from the night Isabella had described what the Nexus archive actually contained. Ms. Sterling has been fully briefed, Daltrey continued. She's cooperating with the federal investigation at a level that is, frankly, more organized than most. She had documentation we hadn't asked for yet ready before we requested it. That sounds like her, Logan said. Daltrey looked at him briefly, not with overt curiosity, just a small register of something, and moved on. The deposition ended at 12:40. Logan walked out of the federal building into a November afternoon that had decided to make its intentions clear. Low sky, wind off the lake with real teeth in it, the kind of cold that Chicago deployed like a reminder of what it actually was, beneath the architecture and the restaurants, and the general pretense of being a comfortable place to live. He turned up his collar and walked to where he'd parked. His phone showed a text from Isabella's assistant, Diane, confirming that tomorrow's schedule was unchanged. Pickup at 8 from the penthouse, board presentation at 10, lunch through the afternoon on the north side. Normal. The normalcy of it had a slightly unreal quality, the way things did when you'd been operating at a different elevation for a while and then returned to ordinary altitude. He'd felt this before, after deployments, the strangeness of regular things. He drove to Emma's school and sat in the pickup line with the other parents and watched a group of kids come through the main doors in the specific organized chaos of fourth graders being released. And Emma came through it in her blue jacket with her backpack slung from one shoulder the way he'd asked her 100 times not to carry it. And she climbed into the car and said, "How was the thing?" because he'd told her he had a meeting this morning without specifying what kind. "Long," he said. "Was it boring?" "Parts of it." She nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "Mrs. Patrice says federal government meetings are always boring because bureaucracy sucks the life out of everything." Logan looked at her. "Did Mrs. Patrice say that to you directly?" "She was on the phone. I was in the kitchen." "You were eavesdropping." "I was getting a snack." She pulled her backpack onto her lap. "Same thing, but with crackers." He drove and said nothing, and felt something in his chest that was not the residual rib pain from the Harrington, that was fading down to a manageable ache on deep breaths, but something adjacent to it in location and completely different in nature. The particular feeling of a man who understood, with cellular clarity, exactly what he had been protecting when he walked through that hotel's service entrance. 3 weeks after the Harrington incident, Isabella called Logan into her office. This had not happened before. In 14 months, their interaction had existed in a precise and well-defined space: the car, the curb, the lobby. She texted ready, and he was there, and she got in, and they drove, and he held the door, and she went into buildings, and he waited, and she came out again. She had never asked him to come upstairs. He'd been to the Sterling Cyber offices on the 47th floor of a glass tower on Wacker Drive perhaps a dozen times, to the lobby, to collect or deliver documents twice, once to wait in a side room while a meeting ran over. He'd never been to her actual office. He took the elevator to 47 and gave his name to the front desk and was walked back through a corridor with the company's branding on the walls. Clean, expensive, the visual language of a company that wanted to appear authoritative without appearing cold, and through a set of frosted glass doors and into a corner office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked south toward the river and east toward the lake. The office was not what he'd expected. He'd expected it to look like her public presentation. Precise, controlled, everything in its right place. Instead, it was a working space in the real sense, with paper on the desk and 2 coffee cups from different days and a whiteboard on the side wall with handwriting on it that was too small to read from where he stood. Bookshelves that had actual books on them, not the decorative kind that companies bought in bulk for appearances. A child's drawing pinned to the edge of the whiteboard. Not her child, she didn't have children, which meant someone had given it to her and she'd kept it, which told him something about her that the public record didn't. She was standing at the window when he came in. She turned. "Thank you for coming up," she said. "Of course." She gestured to the chair across from her desk and sat in her own chair. And for a moment the dynamic was strange. She was the employer, this was her space, and yet something had shifted in the geometry of how they occupied a room together since the night in the Harrington's maintenance bay. Something that made the formal architecture of employer and employee feel slightly ill-fitting. "The federal investigation is moving," she said. "Daltrey briefed me yesterday. Hale's intermediary network has been identified. I won't say the name because it's under active federal scrutiny, and I've been advised to limit disclosure, but the foreign intelligence connection is confirmed. There will be arrests that go beyond what's already happened." She paused. "The Nexus acquisition is fully secured. The archive is in its proper custodial arrangement and has been independently verified by the relevant government agencies." She looked at him. "It's done." "Good," he said. "The board has been restructured with interim appointments pending the full investigation." 3 of the 4 board members who were implicated have entered cooperation agreements. The 4th is contesting everything, which his attorney is going to find increasingly difficult to sustain. She had her hands flat on the desk. The company is intact. The people who tried to take it apart are in federal custody, or will be shortly. She paused. All of this is because of what happened on the night of the 14th. It's because the investigators did their jobs, he said. Logan? It's also because you didn't go to your knees, he said. That matters. If you'd complied with the team leader's positioning immediately, the dynamic changes. You bought time. She looked at him. I threw a chair. You threw a chair at exactly the right moment. That's not nothing. I didn't have a plan. I was furious and I picked up the nearest object. Fury and the nearest object has won more engagements than people give it credit for. He said this without irony. You acted. That's what mattered. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the particular quality of attention she'd had since that night. Seeing him differently, he knew, not through the screen of the job, but as the more complicated thing underneath it. He understood this and didn't mind it exactly, but it required adjustment. I want to talk to you about something, she said, and I want you to hear it fully before you respond. He nodded. She opened her desk drawer and removed a small box, wooden, the size that might hold a piece of jewelry or a set of keys, and set it on the desk between them, but didn't open it yet. When I was 23, she said, I was working 80-hour weeks in a rented office with secondhand equipment and a business plan that 24 investors had passed on. I had $11,000 in a savings account that was decreasing at a rate that was going to be 0 in 4 months. She looked at the box. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, she was 60. She'd built a manufacturing company from nothing in the 80s. Came to see me on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd heard about me from someone. She sat across from me and listened to my pitch for 40 minutes, and then she said, I'm not going to invest in your company, but I'm going to give you something better. She paused. She gave me her time. 12 months of mentorship, every other week, no equity, no return expected. She said that the people who'd helped her when she had nothing had never asked for anything back. And she'd spent 30 years trying to do the same. Logan listened. I've thought about that a lot, Isabella said. The question of what you owe people who change your life. And the answer, I've always believed, is that you can't pay it back. You can only pay it forward. She looked at him directly. But there are moments when paying it forward is insufficient, and what's required is something more direct. She opened the box. Inside was a key. A house key, attached to a small tag with an address on it. A North Side address, Logan noted. A neighborhood he knew. A good neighborhood. The house at that address was purchased 3 days ago, she said. It's a 4-bedroom in Lincoln Square. Good school district, a backyard. She paused. It's been transferred to your name. The paperwork is complete. Logan looked at the key for a long moment. He looked up at her. Isabella, let me finish. Her voice was steady. I know what you're going to say. You're going to say you were doing your job, or that anyone would have done the same, or some version of it's not necessary that is going to make me want to throw a chair at you, which, as we've established, is something I'm capable of. He said nothing. You have a 10-year-old daughter, she said. You're raising her alone in an apartment that I've driven past because your address was in your employment file, and which I'm certain is adequate, but which is not what you would have built for her if the circumstances of the last 6 years had been different. Her voice didn't waver, but it had moved slightly from the register of a business presentation into something more human. You walked into a building to protect me knowing that you might not walk out. Emma was at her neighbor's apartment having ice cream, and you went in anyway because of who you are. A pause. The least I can do is make sure that she grows up in a house with a backyard. Logan sat with this. He looked at the key in the box. He thought about Emma's apartment bedroom, which was painted yellow because Emma had wanted yellow, and he'd spent a Saturday morning doing it badly and they'd laughed about the uneven patches. And he thought about the school she walked to and the neighbors she knew and Mrs. Patrice 3 floors down who let her have 2 scoops of ice cream. And he thought about what Claire would have said, and then he stopped thinking about that because it was a path he needed to walk carefully. I don't know how to accept something like this, he said. I know, she said. You're going to do it anyway. It's not charity, she said. Her voice was firm now, the way it got firm when she'd decided something. It's a debt being paid in the only currency that is proportionate to what you gave. If you refuse it, you are making a decision that affects Emma, not just yourself, and I don't think you'll do that.
Yet,
This was, Logan recognized, a move that a very intelligent person made when they understood the opponent's position completely. She'd found the argument he couldn't counter because it was correct. He looked at the key for another long moment. The school district, he said. Lincoln Elementary, she said. Ranked 4th in the city. He was quiet. There's also something else, she said. Her tone shifted slightly, more careful. The company's security operation needs restructuring. The investigation has made clear that the entire executive protection and internal security apparatus requires rebuilding from the ground up. She paused. I would like to offer you the position of Director of Security Operations for Sterling Cyber. He looked at her. Before you say anything, she said, I'm aware that you left that world intentionally. I'm aware of why. I'm not asking you to become the person you were before. The role would be primarily organizational, building the right team, establishing the right protocols, advising on risk assessment. The field work would be your call, not a requirement. She held his gaze. You have knowledge that no one else I could hire has. You understand how operations like the one at the Harrington are planned and executed from the inside. That knowledge protects people. I'm a driver, he said. You're a former Navy SEAL with 12 years of executive protection and hostage recovery experience who has been driving my car for 14 months because you needed ordinary. She said this without unkindness. I'm not asking you to give up ordinary. I'm asking you to use what you know in a way that ordinary people can't. Logan stood up and walked to the window. Below, the Chicago River moved between its concrete banks in the flat gray light of the November afternoon. And the city went about its enormous indifferent business, the way it always did. He thought about the conversation in the linen room, Isabella's voice saying, I trust you with the particular quality of someone who had just decided, and the sound of Emma's voice message, and the cold weight of the hotel's service entrance door under his palm at 7:57 on the night of the 14th. He thought about what he'd told Isabella in the maintenance bay. I used to have a job where knowing things like that kept people alive, and the past tense of it, the choice embedded in that past tense, and whether the choice had been about the work itself or about the conditions under which the work was done. He thought about Claire, who had made him promise to come home to Emma, and what she'd meant by home. I'll consider the position, he said to the window. I'm not saying yes. I'm saying I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking, Isabella said. He turned. The house... He stopped. The house is not conditional on the job, she said. The house is the house. Those are two separate things. He looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him without flinching, the way she'd looked at the team leader in the Harrington private dining room, the refusal to be smaller than the moment required. He crossed back to the desk and picked up the key. It was heavier than a key had a right to be, or maybe it just felt that way because of what it represented. The particular weight of a life pivoting, the hinge point of before and after. He'd held other things that felt this way. Dog tags, a folded flag, a discharge paper. Small objects that contained large meanings. He closed his fingers around it. Thank you, he said. She nodded once. And then, because she was Isabella Sterling and she had built a billion-dollar company at 31, on the principle that sentiment and practicality were not opposites. Don't thank me. Just make sure Emma does well in 4th-ranked Lincoln Elementary. He looked at her and almost laughed. Almost, but... He drove home that afternoon through traffic that was thickening toward the evening rush, the key in his jacket pocket, and he was quiet in the particular way he'd been quiet on the drive home from the Harrington, the quiet of a man who had walked through something significant and was still, in some interior way, sorting through what he'd found on the other side. He picked Emma up from school at 3:30. She got in the car and immediately said, "You're weird today," which was Emma's standard diagnostic and which was almost always accurate. "I have something to tell you," he said. She looked at him with the focused attention she deployed when she sensed something that required it. She was her mother's daughter in this way. The ability to be fully present in a conversation when it mattered, to stop fidgeting and simply look. He drove for a block before he said it. "We're getting a new house." Emma was quiet for 3 seconds. "What kind of house?" 4 bedrooms, Lincoln Square. It has a backyard. Another silence. He could feel her processing this in real time. The 10-year-old version of running numbers, mapping what it meant, checking it against the things she knew and cared about. Is our apartment bad? She asked. I don't think our apartment is bad. Our apartment is fine, he said. This is just something better. Why do we get something better? He thought about how to answer this. I helped someone, he said, and they wanted to do something for us. The driving job lady? The driving job lady. Emma absorbed this. Is she nice? He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She's direct, he said. She says what she means. She works very hard. He paused. She threw a chair once when she needed to. Emma appeared to find this highly satisfactory. I like her, she announced. You've never met her. The chair thing, Emma said, with the certainty of a 10-year-old who has made a final ruling. People who throw chairs when they need to are usually good people. Logan drove and said nothing and felt the key against his ribs through the jacket fabric, and thought that this was one of the things about his daughter. The way she cut to what was true without realizing she was doing it, the way Claire had done, the same instinct in a smaller and louder form. Can I have the room with the biggest window? Emma asked. We haven't seen the house yet. But if the room with the biggest window is available, Emma, I'm just planning ahead. You can have the room with the biggest window, he said. She settled back in her seat with the satisfaction of someone whose most pressing negotiation had been successfully concluded. She looked out at the city going by. After a moment, she said, without particular drama, Dad, you know I think you're really great, right? Logan kept his eyes on the road. I know, he said. Mom would think so too, she said, in case you ever wonder. He drove in silence for the length of a block, and the city moved past the windows in the gray November light, and somewhere behind his ribs, in the place that still ached when he breathed too deep, something loosened slightly. I know that too, he said, and they drove on through the city together, the key in his pocket, the address on the tag, and the whole complicated weight of a life that was, against reasonable odds, still moving forward. They moved into the Lincoln Square house on a Saturday in early December, when the first real snow of the season had come down overnight and left 2 inches on everything. The front steps, the backyard fence, the oak tree that stood at the property's edge, with its bare arms holding small white lines along every branch. Logan had rented a cargo van for the day. He and Emma had packed the apartment over 3 evenings, and the boxes were not well organized. Emma had labeled several of them with descriptions that were more editorial than practical, including one that said, Dad's boring stuff, and another that said, My important things do not open, which Logan had not opened and did not intend to, Mrs. Patrice had come down to help and had spent most of the morning sitting on the apartment floor supervising while eating crackers, which was her characteristic contribution to physical labor, and which Logan had accepted without comment because she'd looked after Emma for 2 years and some debts you paid in patience. The move took most of the day. The van was heavier than he'd planned because Emma had not, despite several conversations on the topic, edited her book collection, and book collections had a specific relationship with gravity that revealed itself most completely when you were carrying boxes up porch steps in December. He said nothing about this. He carried the boxes. By 4 in the afternoon, when the light was already flattening toward the early dark of winter, the van was empty and the house was full of the particular disorder of a first day. Boxes in the wrong rooms, furniture not yet where it would eventually live, the kitchen containing only a coffee maker and a bag of groceries that Emma had insisted on selecting herself and which contained, he'd discovered, 3 kinds of cereal, string cheese, apples, and an inexplicable jar of fancy mustard. Emma stood in the center of the living room with her coat still on and looked around at all of it. It's bigger than I thought, she said. It's a 4-bedroom house. Our whole apartment could fit in the living room. That's an exaggeration. She looked at him. The living room and most of the kitchen, she amended. He set down the box he was carrying and looked around at the space, too. It was a good house, built in the 40s, solid bones, the kind of place that had been lived in long enough to have the particular settled quality of a house that knew what it was. Wood floors throughout, slightly scuffed in the places that told you where previous families had spent their time. Bay window in the front room. a fireplace that he hadn't tested yet but intended to. The backyard through the kitchen windows was white now, the snow undisturbed, the fence along the back edge catching the late afternoon light. "Go find your room," he said. Emma was already moving before he finished the sentence. He heard her footsteps above him as she moved through the second floor, room to room, evaluating. He unpacked the coffee maker and found the outlet and started a pot, and he stood at the kitchen window and watched the backyard snow and did the thing he did when significant things happened, which was to be very still with it for a moment. Not processing, exactly, just acknowledging, letting it register in the full dimension of what it was. This was the home he hadn't been able to give them before. This was what Claire had imagined in the way that people imagined future things while they still could. A yard, a school within walking distance, a place where Emma could grow up with enough room around her. He'd known what they'd wanted and had spent years building toward it by different means, and then the means had changed without warning, the way means always did. And here he was in a kitchen in Lincoln Square with a coffee maker running and his daughter's footsteps on the floor above him and 2 inches of snow on a backyard he now owned. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth and said nothing to the empty kitchen. From upstairs, Emma shouted, "I found the room with the biggest window." "Good," he called back. "It's perfect." "Good. Also, there's a closet with a little door in the back that goes nowhere." He paused. "What do you mean it goes nowhere?" "It just ends, like a little hallway that stops." "That's a crawl space, Emma." "It's mysterious." He poured his coffee and decided this was not a battle worth engaging before dinner. He thought about Isabella's offer every day for 2 weeks. Not obsessively. He'd trained himself out of obsessive thinking, the same way he'd trained himself out of a dozen other habits that didn't serve him, through discipline and the deliberate practice of putting things down when they weren't productive to carry. But consistently, in the margins of the day. During the drive to Isabella's penthouse in the mornings, he'd find himself mapping the Sterling Cyber Building's security layout in his head the way he used to map operational environments, entry points, blind spots, the 4-minute gap in elevator camera coverage that a competent security team would have closed immediately and which the old team had apparently accepted as standard. During Emma's school pickup, sitting in the parent line, he'd review the staffing structure that Daltrey had described during the deposition. The way the internal security apparatus had been structured with too many single points of failure, too much concentrated authority in Kowalski's hands. He'd done this his whole life, assessed environments, found the weaknesses, thought about how to close them. He'd thought of it as a burden in the years after leaving the Navy, a reflex he couldn't fully switch off. It occurred to him, sitting in the school pickup line on a Thursday morning watching parents check their phones, that he'd been thinking about it wrong. He called his former commanding officer on a Thursday evening while Emma was doing homework. Commander Dan Harwick had retired from Naval Special Warfare Command 2 years ago and was living in San Diego and consulting for a private firm and fishing on weekends, which was the kind of retirement he'd always said he wanted, and which he'd described to Logan once as not as restful as I expected, but better than the alternative. He answered on the second ring in the particular way of people who kept their phones close out of habit they'd never fully shaken. "Mercer," Harwick said. Not a greeting exactly, more like an identification. "Commander?" "You can stop calling me Commander. I've been retired for 2 years. "Habit." A brief pause. "I heard about Chicago," Harwick said. "Daltrey reached out for a character reference." "I know. He told me. I told him you were the best trained executive protection operator I'd worked with, and also one of the most stubborn people I'd ever met, and that he should expect you to give him exactly what he needed and nothing more." "That's accurate," Logan said. "What are you calling about?" Logan leaned against the kitchen counter and looked at the backyard through the window. The snow from the move-in day had been added to twice since then and was now a reliable 4 inches, and Emma had made an attempt at a snowman that had collapsed under its own structural ambitions and was now a snow mound with a scarf on it, which was sitting in the yard looking philosophical. He told Harwick about the offer. Harwick listened without interrupting, which was one of his qualities that Logan had always respected. When Logan finished, there was a silence of perhaps 5 seconds before Harwick spoke. "What's the hesitation?" "I left that world for a reason." "You left operational field work for a reason," Harwick said, which was Emma and which was the right call. "This isn't operational field work. It's adjacent to it." Most things worth doing are adjacent to something hard, Harwick said. You know what the actual question is. Logan was quiet. The actual question, Harwick continued, is whether you can do this job in a way that keeps the promise you made. Not the letter of it, the spirit of it. Whether you can use what you know without it pulling you back into the person you were, or more specifically into the conditions that made that person necessary. Claire made me promise to come home to Emma. And you have been, every night for 6 years. Harwick's voice was level and not unkind. Coming home doesn't stop being possible just because the job changes. You know that. Logan said nothing. You've been a driver for 14 months, Harwick said. Not because you're a driver, because you needed ordinary, and ordinary served its purpose. You were there for Emma when she needed you to just be her father. But she's 10 now. She's not going to need the same thing from you at 16 or 20. A pause. You're 37 years old, Logan. You have 30 years of working life ahead of you. What are you going to do with it? The snow mound with the scarf stood in the yard in the dark. I don't know yet, Logan said. Yes, you do, Harwick said. You've known since the night at the hotel. You just haven't let yourself say it. Logan looked at the yard for a moment longer. Thanks, Commander, he said. Call me Dan for the love of... Fine. You're welcome, Mercer. He called Isabella the next morning at 7:15 before he'd left for the pickup. She answered immediately. Logan? I'll take the position, he said, with conditions. A brief pause that had a quality of satisfaction in it that she was too professional to make explicit. What conditions? I pick Emma up from school every day at 3:30, non-negotiable. If the job requires something that conflicts with that, the job adapts, not the pickup. Agreed. I won't carry a weapon in the office environment. In the field, my call. Agreed. I build the team from scratch. I don't inherit Kowalski's structure or his people. Full authority on hiring and protocol design. That was my intention, she said. What else? I keep driving you, he said. A pause. Logan, the Director of Security Operations doesn't need to... I'm aware of what the Director of Security Operations needs to do. I'm telling you what I'm choosing to do. He picked up his keys from the counter. I know your schedule, I know your routes, I know how you move and what you miss when you're focused on something else. Replacing me with a new driver means starting that knowledge from zero with someone I haven't vetted yet. Until I'm satisfied with whoever takes over the driving permanently, I stay in the car. A longer pause. You're a difficult man. You said that already. I'm reiterating it. Is that a yes? Yes, she said. All of it. Yes. And then, with the slight softening that appeared in her voice occasionally in the moments when the professional register stepped briefly aside, Thank you, Logan. See you at 8, he said. The Sterling Cyber All-Company meeting was scheduled for the second Friday in January, 6 weeks after the Harrington incident. Isabella had announced it 10 days in advance through the company's internal communications system with a subject line that said, Important company-wide update, and a brief note that said attendance was expected for all Chicago-based employees and that remote offices should tune in via the live stream. This language was measured and intentional, the way Isabella's communication always was, conveying weight without generating panic, signaling significance without specification. The meeting was held in the company's main event space on the 44th floor, a large open room with retractable seating that was used for product launches and all-hands presentations, and the annual holiday event that Logan had once driven 3 board members to, and which had apparently involved an open bar and a situation with the CFO and a karaoke machine that several employees still referenced obliquely in his presence. The room held 400 people comfortably and could be stretched to 550, and on the second Friday in January, it was stretched. Logan arrived early with the intention of reviewing the room configuration and the building's access protocols, which was now part of his job description in a formal sense, though he'd been doing it informally since the day he started driving. He walked the perimeter, noted the 2 additions to the lobby security team that he'd already put in place. Former military, both of them, a woman named Anita Torres and a man named Derek Chu, who had the combination of credentials and actual instinct that was harder to find than their resumes suggested, and confirmed that the camera network was active on all 32 channels, which it was, because he'd personally supervised the replacement of the outdated system 3 weeks ago, with equipment that didn't have the factory default vulnerabilities of its predecessor. He did all of this without calling attention to himself, which was easier now than it had been in the first week after the Harrington, when he'd been somewhat visible in ways he hadn't particularly enjoyed. The federal investigation had kept most of the operational details out of the public record, which he was grateful for. The company knew something had happened, the way companies knew things. Through the particular grapevine of shared space and overheard conversation and the specific texture of institutional change, they knew that several board members had been removed, that there had been an incident at the Harrington Grand involving their CEO, that James Kowalski was gone, that a new security infrastructure was appearing around them with quiet efficiency. They didn't know most of the specifics, and Logan intended to keep it that way. He positioned himself at the back of the event space, near the secondary entrance, where he could see the stage and both main exits and the door to the green room where Isabella was currently preparing. He wore a dark suit that was more formal than his driving clothes and slightly less formal than what the senior executives wore, a deliberate calibration. He had a radio earpiece in his left ear that was connected to Torres and Chu and two additional team members he'd placed on the building's perimeter. This was, objectively speaking, more security than an internal company meeting required. He'd decided that was acceptable. The room filled. 400 and something employees, he estimated closer to 470, arranged themselves in the tiered seating and along the standing areas at the back, and there was the particular energy of a crowd that had been told something significant was happening and was both apprehensive and curious, which was the standard operating condition of employees whose company had spent the last 6 weeks in a state of visible flux. Isabella came out from the green room at 9:58 and walked onto the stage, and the room quieted with a speed that told Logan something about how the company felt about her. Not the manufactured quiet of an obligation, but the real kind, the kind that came from people who actually wanted to hear what someone had to say. She was wearing a dark blue jacket and no jewelry except small earrings, and she stood at the center of the stage without notes, which he'd expected. She didn't use notes when it mattered. She looked out at the room for a moment before she spoke, and in that moment Logan thought she was doing what he did sometimes, taking inventory, cataloging what she was looking at, noting what was present and what was absent. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I'll start with what you actually want to know. The company is secure. The investigation is ongoing, but contained. Everyone sitting in this room has a job, and this company has a future, and neither of those things was certain 6 weeks ago." The room was very still. I'm not going to give you a sanitized version of what happened, because you've spent 6 weeks reading between the lines of carefully worded internal communications, and you deserve better than more of that. She paused. She, several members of our board, and the person I trusted to lead our internal security were working against this company and against the people in it. They attempted something on the night of November 14th that failed. It failed because of law enforcement, because of the federal investigators who moved quickly and thoroughly, and because of one person who was in the right place and who did what needed to be done. Well, Logan looked at the exit sign above the secondary door and was very carefully not looking at the stage. "I'm not going to embarrass that person by going into detail," Isabella said, "because I know him well enough to know that he will find a way to not be on this stage if I try to put him there." A brief pause that had a specific quality of wry awareness in it. "But I want this company to know that the reason we are all standing here, the reason the Nexus acquisition closed, the reason your jobs and the work you have invested in this company are intact, is because of the kind of person who looks after others without expecting anything in return, who acts when action is necessary and asks for nothing afterward." Logan's radio crackled once, Chu checking in from the lobby, routine. He touched his earpiece and responded with the single press that meant received, all clear. "What I've learned in the last 6 weeks," Isabella continued, "is something I'd like to think I already knew. I've spent 11 years building this company on the premise that talent and intelligence and strategy are the highest values, and they matter, but they're not the highest values." She looked out at the room. "Loyalty is the willingness to protect something larger than yourself, without calculation, without keeping score. That is the thing that actually holds everything else together. And we almost lost this company because some very intelligent, very strategic people forgot that." She paused. "We're not going to forget it," she said. "That's my commitment to you." The room absorbed this. Not with applause. The moment didn't call for applause, and the crowd seemed to understand that instinctively, but with the particular quality of collective stillness that meant people were taking something in rather than performing a response to it. Then she stepped off the stage. Logan registered this and for a moment wasn't sure what she was doing. She hadn't walked off the stage, she'd stepped down from it. A different motion, more deliberate, and she was moving into the room rather than toward the green room, and the crowd parted slightly in front of her the way crowds did when someone moved with a specific destination in mind. He understood what was happening approximately 4 seconds before it happened. He had time to consider his options, which were move toward the side exit, pretend to receive a communication requiring his immediate attention, or simply accept the inevitable with some measure of dignity. He chose the third option because the first two were transparently avoidant and because he was 37 years old and had spent 12 years in environments that made corporate event spaces seem profoundly manageable. Isabella walked to the back of the room and stopped in front of him. 470 people turned to look. Logan held very still. She was holding the wooden box. He hadn't seen her carry it out, which meant she'd had it in the green room and had planned this, which was entirely consistent with how she operated. She held it out to him. He didn't take it immediately. He looked at her and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You said you weren't going to embarrass me." "I said I wasn't going to put you on the stage," she said. "I'm giving you a box. Those are different things." He looked at the box. "Take it," she said. Still quiet, but the kind of quiet that wasn't a request. He took it. She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was direct and unperformed and had in it everything she'd said in the office 2 weeks ago about debts and proportionality and the particular quality of a person who acted without calculation. Then she said for the room as much as for him, "Thank you for everything." Logan stood at the back of the room with a wooden box in his hands and 470 people looking at him, and he did not know exactly what his face was doing, which was unusual for him because he generally knew. But he was aware that something in it had moved and that he didn't entirely mind. He nodded once. She turned and walked back toward the stage, and the room followed her with their attention, and Logan stood where he was for a moment and then opened the box. The key was inside, same as before. He looked at the address tag. He already knew the address. He'd driven past the house twice since the day Isabella gave him the key, not to go inside, but just to look at it from the car in the way that a person drove past something they hadn't yet accepted as real. The oak tree in the front, the porch with the 2 steps, the bay window. He'd looked at it and kept driving. He closed the box. Torres's voice came through the earpiece. "Lobby, all clear. Chu, building perimeter, all clear. His 2 additional team members, positions confirmed, nothing to report." The building was secure. The event space was secure. 470 employees were filing out into their Friday morning in various states of feeling moved or thoughtful or simply ready for coffee, the way people were after something that mattered. Logan clipped the wooden box under his arm and walked toward the secondary exit to begin the walkthrough that concluded every security event, and as he walked, he was thinking about Emma in the house this morning when he'd left. Still in her pajamas, eating the inexplicable fancy mustard on toast, which she'd apparently decided was acceptable, telling him about a project she was doing for school about the Chicago River, and asking if they could walk to it this weekend. He'd said yes. He'd said it the way he'd been saying yes more often lately. Not as an accommodation, not managing the gap between what he had available and what she needed, but from a place that felt more like sufficiency. Like a man who had the time and the proximity and the actual presence to be the father he'd promised to be, without the constant calculation of what he was giving up to do it. He reached the secondary exit and held the door and looked back at the room, nearly empty now, the stage light still up, the residue of something that had mattered still present in the air, the way the smell of weather stayed in a room after the window closed. He thought, Claire would have found this funny. The box. The 470 people. The key. She would have said something precise and slightly devastating about it, something about the look on his face. She had been excellent at that. He allowed himself a few seconds with this thought, which was the appropriate amount of time, and then he went through the door. The investigation closed formally in late January. Richard Hale was charged on 7 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, conspiracy against a national security custodianship arrangement, an accessory to attempted kidnapping. He would be tried in federal court in the spring. His attorney was, as Isabella had predicted, finding the case increasingly difficult to contest, given that the encrypted drive had continued to yield material at a rate that seemed designed to specifically undermine every defense strategy available. James Kowalski received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, which Logan had expected and accepted as the practical outcome of how these things worked, without enthusiasm. Kowalski had done what he'd done and would carry it, and the reduced sentence was not mercy so much as utility, and there was a difference. The contractor who had assembled and deployed the kidnapping team was identified and arrested in February through a joint federal operation that Logan had been tangentially briefed on by Daltrey, who had developed the habit of keeping Logan informed with the mild regularity of someone who had decided it was simpler to include him than to manage the alternative. The 3 board members who had cooperated received their reduced charges and would serve minimal time. The 4th, who had continued to contest, would fare considerably worse when the trial concluded. Logan read each development in the case the way he read operational after-action reports. For completeness, for the gaps, for the shape of what had actually happened as distinguished from what any individual participant had understood it to be. He didn't discuss these details with Emma, who knew only the outline, that her father had helped someone, that someone had been grateful, that they now lived in a house with a backyard and a mysterious crawlspace. Emma had decided the crawlspace was for reading. She'd put a pillow in it and a flashlight and 2 books, and she used it with the frequency and gravity of someone who had discovered a space designed specifically for them, which Logan had come to think was probably true. He told her one evening in December, sitting on the floor of the living room while they assembled a bookshelf from a flat-pack box with instructions that appeared to have been translated from Swedish through several intermediate languages. "I'm going to have a new job, still at the same company, different kind of work." Emma had looked at him over the instruction sheet. More driving? Less driving. More making sure people are safe. She'd considered this. "Is it dangerous?" "Less than before," he said. "I'm going to build the team and run the operation. I won't be in the field unless I need to be." "What does the field mean?" "It means the places where things happen." She'd looked at the instruction sheet again and then at the pile of shelf components. "Okay," she said, "but you still pick me up at 3:30. Every day?" She'd nodded and handed him a small metal bracket. "Then this piece goes here, and I think you've been holding it upside down for 10 minutes. He'd looked at the bracket. She was correct. "Thank you," he said. "I'm good at noticing things," she said with the particular modest satisfaction of someone who knew they were right. He looked at her, this 10-year-old person with Claire's eyes and his stubbornness and her own specific quality of clarity that belonged to neither of them, and thought that this was in fact what it looked like. Not the completion of something, not the resolution of a before and after, just a life, moving, in a house with a backyard and a mysterious crawl space and a jar of fancy mustard in the refrigerator, carrying what it carried and building what it was building. He turned the bracket right side up and found the right slot for it, and the shelf came together and they finished it before dinner. The trial of Richard Hale began on a Tuesday in March, when Chicago was doing the thing it did in early spring, pretending to warm up and then reconsidering, the temperature sitting in the low 40s with a wind off the lake that made it feel like late February had simply refused to leave. Logan drove Isabella to the federal courthouse on South Dearborn on the first morning, not because she was testifying that day, but because she had decided she would be present for the opening arguments, and she had told Logan this the evening before in the tone she used when she had already made a decision and was informing rather than consulting. He pulled up to the courthouse entrance at 8:45 and looked at the cluster of media vehicles on the sidewalk, 3 news vans, a dozen journalists with cameras, and the particular patient purposefulness of people who had been standing in cold weather for a professional reason, and said nothing about it because she'd already seen it and was already organizing her posture in the way she did when she was preparing to be looked at. "I'll be in the second row overflow seating," she said, "not at the plaintiff's table. Marcus will handle the morning." "I know," he said. "I'll be in the lobby." She looked at him. "You don't have to stay." "I know that too," he said. She held his look for a moment, then opened her door and got out, and he watched her walk through the cluster of cameras with her head level and her pace even, and her expression the calibrated neutral of someone who had decided that the journalist would get nothing from her face today, and he thought that she was, in her way, doing the same thing he did in professional settings, carrying something considerable without showing the weight of it, which was a skill that looked easy from the outside and was not. He parked in the structure on State Street and walked back and sat in the lobby of the federal courthouse on a wooden bench that had been designed by someone who had not prioritized comfort, and he drank bad coffee from a vending machine and read the news on his phone and waited, the way he had always been good at waiting. The opening arguments took 2 hours and 40 minutes. He knew this because Isabella texted him at 11:53. Done for the morning, 5 minutes. She came through the courthouse doors, and the cameras found her again, and she walked past them without stopping. And he had the car at the curb and the rear door open, and she got in, and he closed it, and they drove north toward the office. "How was it?" he asked. "Organized," she said. "Marcus is very good at organized." A pause. Hale looked smaller than I expected. Logan said nothing. "I don't mean physically," she said. "I mean, the version of him in my memory has been carrying a lot of weight. The version sitting at that table is just a man who made a series of choices that he can't take back." She looked out the window. "I thought I'd feel something different seeing him. Anger, maybe. I mostly just felt tired." "That's usually how it goes," Logan said. She looked at the back of his head. He could feel it. "Experience talking?" "Enough of it." She was quiet for a block. "Does the tiredness go away?" He thought about this honestly, which she deserved more than a reassuring answer. "It changes shape," he said. "It stops being about the specific person. It becomes more general. Just the awareness that people do this, that it's not exceptional, which is both better and worse than being about the specific person." She received this without response, which meant she was absorbing it rather than dismissing it, and he respected that about her. The willingness to sit with an honest answer instead of looking for a more comfortable one. They drove the rest of the way to the office without speaking, and it was a comfortable silence, the kind that had taken them a few months to build and that now had its own particular quality. Two people who had been through something together and no longer needed to explain themselves across every gap. The trial lasted 11 days. Logan attended none of it except the morning of the verdict, when he drove Isabella to the courthouse for the last time and sat in the lobby again on the same uncomfortable bench and waited. The jury had been out for a day and a half, which Marcus Chen told Isabella was a good sign, which he meant in the technical legal sense of suggesting that the deliberation time indicated thorough engagement rather than a quick dismissal or a quick conviction, both of which could mean different things. Isabella had relayed this to Logan without commenting on it, and he hadn't commented either, because the waiting was the waiting, and commentary didn't shorten it. The verdict came at 2:17 in the afternoon, guilty on 5 of 7 counts. The 2 counts that didn't result in conviction were related to the foreign intelligence connection, which the prosecution had presented, but which the jury had not found sufficiently supported beyond reasonable doubt given the classified nature of the underlying evidence, a constraint that the federal prosecutors had anticipated and had built their case around as best they could, but which was, as Daltrey had explained to Logan during one of his informal briefings, simply the friction of operating in the space where national security law and criminal prosecution overlapped. 5 counts. Conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, conspiracy against a custodianship arrangement tied to national security assets, accessory to attempted kidnapping. 2 additional counts related to wire fraud and financial crimes connected to the intermediary payment structure. Logan got the text from Isabella at 2:22. It said, 5 counts guilty. Sentencing in 6 weeks. He sent back a single word, good. She sent back, yes. He was in the car in the parking structure where he'd gone after lunch to do a radio check with Torres, who was managing the building security in his absence. He sat for a moment after the texts, with the phone in his hand and the parking structure's particular quality of silence around him, concrete and fluorescence and the distant sound of a car somewhere on another level. He thought about the night of November 14th, standing outside the Harrington Grand in the rain, watching 3 black SUVs move at exactly 25 miles per hour down Michigan Avenue. He thought about the moment in the maintenance bay when Isabella had said, "I trust you with the weight of someone making a decision they meant." He thought about Pete Vargas propped against a wall with zip ties on his wrists, and the cold concrete of the utility corridor, and the key sitting in the wooden box. He thought about Emma, who had no real understanding of any of this, and who, when he'd told her briefly in February that the legal process was moving forward, had said, "Good, so it's almost done?" in the tone of someone who found prolonged institutional processes inefficient, and had then gone back to her reading in the crawl space. He started the car and drove to the courthouse entrance and waited. Isabella came out with Marcus Chen, who was a small, precise man with the particular energy of someone who ran on deadline pressure and had just had a very good 2 weeks professionally. He was talking as they walked, and Isabella was listening with her head slightly tilted in the way she listened when information was coming fast and she was sorting it in real time. They reached the car and Marcus shook Logan's hand with genuine warmth. He'd done this since they'd met in January, the handshake of someone who had been told the story and wanted to convey something with the gesture without making a speech. And then he went to find his own car, and Isabella got in, and Logan drove. They were halfway to the office when she said, "Sentencing is April 29th. The prosecutor is asking for 14 to 18 years. He'll likely get 12 with good behavior eligibility," Logan said. "Federal sentencing guidelines. That's still 12 years. A pause. "The others, the board members, they've already received their sentences. 18 months to 3 years with the cooperation credit." She was looking out the window. "I keep thinking about the 18 months. That one of the people who tried to do this to the company, to the people in it, to the national security framework we'd spent 11 months building, walks out in 18 months. That bothers you. Doesn't it bother you?" He considered the honest answer again. "Yes," he said. "And also no, because the alternative, a system where the outcome scales only with how angry the victim is, doesn't work either. The cooperation produced the Hale conviction. Without Kowalski's testimony, 2 of the 5 counts don't hold." He drove for a moment. Imperfect systems produce imperfect outcomes. The system working imperfectly is still better than it failing completely. She looked at the side of his face. "You've thought about this. I've had a lot of time in cars. You've been driving me for, 18 months now?" 19, he said. "You should have told me to find a new driver 6 months ago. I told you I'd stay until I was satisfied with whoever took over." And? He was quiet for a moment. He'd been interviewing candidates for the permanent driver position for 3 weeks. He'd interviewed 9 people. 7 had been dismissed quickly, 4 on protocol gaps, 2 on situational awareness deficits that only revealed themselves when you watched them navigate actual environments rather than answer interview questions. One who had been technically excellent, but who had a quality in his eyes when he thought no one was watching that Logan didn't like and couldn't fully articulate and trust it anyway. The 8th candidate had been close. Former law enforcement, strong instincts, good spatial awareness. He'd been thinking about her. "I have someone," he said. "I want to do 1 more week of observation, but I think she's right." "What's her name?" "Rachel Kim, former Chicago PD, 5 years, left to go private. She's been doing corporate transport for 18 months. He paused. She noticed the camera at the parking structure on Walker was on a 40-second rotation with a 4-second blind window. She mentioned it the second day. Didn't know why I was watching her face when she said it. Isabella was quiet for a moment. "What did your face do?" "Nothing," he said. "What did you think?" "I thought she'd do." Isabella almost smiled. He heard it in the brief exhalation that preceded it. High praise from Logan Mercer. "She'll be good," he said. "Better than me in some ways. She's more patient in traffic." "You're not patient in traffic." "I'm patient about the things that matter," he said. "Traffic is not one of them." Rachel Kim started full-time in mid-April, and Logan spent 2 weeks riding in the front passenger seat, which felt odd in the way that being a passenger always felt odd to him. The specific discomfort of the person who was used to controlling the environment being in the controlled environment instead. He gave her minimal instruction and maximum observation because the instruction was mostly already done, and what remained was the organic calibration that only came from doing the actual work. She was good. She noticed things. She had the right kind of quiet, not passive, not checked out, but the active quiet of someone whose attention was directed outward rather than inward, which was the distinguishing characteristic that Logan had come to think of as the single most important quality in the work. You could teach protocol. You could teach routes and contingencies and radio procedure. You couldn't teach the habit of paying attention when nothing was happening, which was when attention mattered most. On her 8th day, she said, "The building across from the Wacker office, north face, 6th floor. There's been a vehicle in the same parking spot for 3 days, dark blue sedan, different plates each day." Logan looked out the window at the building. He'd clocked the sedan on day 2 and had run the plates and determined it was a private investigator working a domestic case that had nothing to do with Sterling Cyber. He had not mentioned this. "I know," he said. "It's a PI, domestic case." She nodded without commenting on the fact that he'd already known. This, also, was the right response. He told Isabella that evening that Rachel Kim was permanent. Isabella said, "Good. Now get out of the front seat." He was out of the car and in the building by the following Monday. The day Logan officially transitioned full-time into the Director of Security Operations role was a Thursday in late April, the week before Hale's sentencing. It did not feel like a landmark, which was perhaps appropriate because the actual work had been going on for months already. The team building, the protocol design, the infrastructure upgrades, the gradual replacement of a security apparatus that had been built on assumed loyalty with one built on verified competence. The title becoming official was administrative. The thing itself had been happening in the spaces between the administrative. He had a small office on the 46th floor, one floor below Isabella's, which was her idea and his minor objection and her final decision. The office had a window that looked west rather than east or south, which meant it looked at buildings rather than water, which was fine. He'd put nothing on the walls yet. There was a desk and a chair and a second chair for when people came to speak with him, and a whiteboard that he'd immediately filled with the security rotation schedule for the next 60 days, because the whiteboard was the most useful tool in the office, and the decorative possibilities of the walls were not a priority. Torres had stopped by on the first morning to say good morning and to tell him that the lobby camera upgrade on the 32nd channel was complete and that the new monitoring protocol was running cleanly. Chu had sent him a digital report on the perimeter check with a note at the bottom that said, "Welcome to having a desk, boss," which Logan had read without responding to because he was uncertain what the correct response to that was. He sat at the desk and drank coffee and looked at the whiteboard and thought about the fact that he was doing this, that the version of himself that had driven a black Mercedes Maybach in silence for 14 months and carried a folding knife and said, "Good morning, Ms." Sterling and thought of himself as a man who had stepped out of one world permanently was now sitting at a desk on the 46th floor of a glass tower on Wacker Drive with a team of 6 people reporting to him and the title on a temporary nameplate outside his door that said Logan Mercer, Director, Security Operations. He thought, I didn't see this coming. And then he thought, yes, I did. I just wasn't ready to look at it. There was a difference between those two things, and he'd spent enough of his life confusing them. Hale's sentencing was on a Wednesday. Logan did not attend. He sent Isabella a text at 7 in the morning that said, "Let me know when it's done," and she sent back, "I will." And he went to work and ran a security training session with Torres and the 2 newest members of the team, a former Secret Service agent named Marcus Webb, who had the kind of institutional knowledge that came from protecting people who attracted institutional threat, and a woman named Sarah Delgado, who had spent 4 years doing corporate intelligence work and who understood the information side of security in ways that complemented the operational side people Logan had built around her. The session ran from 9 to noon. They worked through 3 scenario protocols that Logan had designed based on the Harrington incident's failure points: the single-person dependency and security leadership, the insufficient compartmentalization of schedule intelligence, the inadequate verification procedure for building security transfers. He'd built these protocols over 6 weeks, not from abstract principle, but from the specific concrete anatomy of what had gone wrong on November 14th, which was the most useful case study he had because he'd been inside it. At 12:47, his phone buzzed. Isabella, 13 years, eligible for parole in 9 with good behavior. He looked at this for a moment. Then, "Marcus says it's on the higher end of what we expected. I think I'm okay." He typed back, "Are you?" A pause of perhaps 30 seconds, which was long for her. Then, I think the honest answer is that I will be, which is probably the right place to land. He typed, "It is." And then, after a moment, "Go eat something. You haven't eaten today." A longer pause. Then, "How do you know that?" "Rachel said you skipped breakfast, and your assistant said you turned down the lunch order." Another pause. "You have informants." "I have a security team," he typed. "Same thing." A brief pause, and then what appeared, for the first time in their entire text message history, to be an emoji, a single, understated thumbs up, which told him she was closer to okay than she'd been in the morning, because Isabella Sterling only deployed emojis from a position of relative equilibrium. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the training session. He picked Emma up at 3:30. Every day, without exception, the same as always. She came through the school doors in the particular explosion of energy that fourth graders exited school buildings with, backpack swinging, jacket unzipped despite the fact that it was still April and still Chicago, and therefore still cold enough to require a zipped jacket, and climbed into the car and said, before she'd fully closed the door, "We're doing a biography project, and I want to do mine on a Navy SEAL." Logan pulled away from the curb. "Any particular one?" She looked at him. The look was extremely pointed. "Emma," he said. "It's for school," she said. "It's educational." "Pick someone else." "Why?" "Because a biography project requires citing sources, and most of what I know about the work is classified or not publicly available, which means you'd be making things up, which is not a biography, which is fiction," she said, "which is also a valid genre." "It is not a valid genre for a biography project." She considered this with the focused displeasure of someone whose best angle of attack has been closed off. "What if I interview you?" "About what?" "About being a dad, and being a SEAL, and how those things go together." He drove in silence for a moment. A bus pulled in front of him and he waited for it, and the city did what it did, and Emma sat in the passenger seat with her backpack on her lap and waited with the particular patience she deployed when she'd said something she knew had landed and was giving it space. "Those things don't go together very easily," he said finally. "I know," she said. "That's what's interesting about it." He looked at her briefly and then back at the road. She was 10 years old, and she understood, at some instinctive level that she couldn't yet fully articulate, the thing that he'd spent 6 years working out for himself, that the interesting part of a person was not the thing that came easily, but the thing that required them to hold two incompatible truths at the same time and live in the tension between them. "You can interview me," he said, "at home, not for the project, just because you want to." She absorbed this distinction. "Okay," she said, in the tone of someone accepting a smaller offer while reserving the right to revisit the original. "But I'm going to take notes." "You're going to take notes on a conversation with your father." "I'm a thorough person," she said with complete sincerity. He drove, and the city moved around them, and Logan thought that this was, among other things, one of the gifts he hadn't expected from this version of his life. The way Emma made him say things he hadn't known he needed to say, in the same way that Claire had done, just at a different altitude and with significantly more logistical questions involved. And that evening, after dinner, Emma sat across from him at the kitchen table with a composition notebook that she'd taken from her school bag and a pencil that she was holding with the professional gravity of someone who had decided to take the exercise seriously. Logan had his coffee. The kitchen was warm. Through the window, the backyard was doing the thing it did in late April. The snow was long gone. The ground was wet and starting to green at the edges. The oak tree at the back fence showing the first small evidence of leaves. Emma looked at her notebook. She'd already written something at the top of the first page. He could read it upside down. Interview. Dad. She looked up. "Okay," she said. "First question. What's the hardest thing about being a SEAL?" He considered the real answer, which was multi-layered and context-dependent and not entirely appropriate for a 10-year-old with a composition notebook. He considered the simple answer, which would be accurate but incomplete. He found the answer that was true at the right altitude. "Leaving," he said. "Not the danger. Not the training. Leaving. Every time you deploy, you leave something behind. And while you're gone, the thing you left keeps changing without you. You come back and you have to learn who everyone is again." He paused. and they have to learn you again too. Except you're always carrying things that you can't bring back with you, so the version of you that comes home is never exactly the one that left. Emma wrote something. He waited. Did that happen with Mom? She asked. He looked at the table for a moment. Yes, and she was patient with it. More patient than she needed to be. He looked up. She told me once that she'd fallen in love with the person who came back from the first deployment, not the one who left. She meant it as a compliment, but it took me a while to understand why. Emma was writing steadily. Why did it take a while? Because it required me to accept that changing isn't the same as being lost. That the things that change you, even the hard things, don't take you away from yourself. They're just additions. Weight you carry. It changes your shape, but it's still you. Emma stopped writing and looked at him. Is that why you drove Ms. Sterling's car? Because you needed something where the weight was less? He looked at his daughter. She was 10 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and something entirely her own that he hadn't finished understanding yet, and suspected he never would, which was fine, which was the correct relationship between a parent and a child, the one that kept teaching. Yes, he said, that's exactly why. She wrote this down with the careful precision of someone preserving something important. And Logan sat at the kitchen table in the house with the backyard and the oak tree and the mysterious crawl space and watched her do it, and felt something that was not simple enough to be called contentment, but was in the neighborhood of it. Something honest and earned and impermanent in the way that all good things were impermanent, which did not make them less good. Second question, Emma said, without looking up. All right. Are you glad you took the new job? He didn't answer immediately because the honest answer required a moment, and he'd learned from Claire that rushing honest answers was its own kind of lie. Yes, he said. I'm glad I took it, not because it's easier than before or harder than before, because it uses the whole of what I know, not just the part of me that knew how to wait quietly in a car, and not the part that knew how to go through a door when things went wrong. All of it, together. He paused. I spent a long time thinking those parts of me were in conflict, that I had to choose between the person who could walk into a burning building and the person who made breakfast on Saturday mornings and helped with math homework. It turns out they're the same person. I just hadn't finished figuring out how to let them coexist. Emma looked at him. Did Ms. Sterling help with that? He thought about this, about the linen room in the Harrington, the wooden box, the key in his jacket pocket on the day of the company meeting, about the conversation on the 47th floor and the chair she'd thrown and the text with the single understated emoji. She gave me an environment where it was possible to figure it out, he said. That's not a small thing. Emma nodded slowly with the gravity of someone taking a note on something that mattered. Then she wrote it down. Isabella reflected on all of this in her own way, in her own time. Not immediately. She was not a person who reflected immediately, because immediacy required a stillness that the operational demands of her life did not easily accommodate. But over the months that followed the Harrington incident, the trial, the sentencing, the restructuring of the company she'd built, she found herself returning to things she'd thought she understood and discovering that she'd understood them at the wrong depth. She'd built Sterling Cyber on the premise that intelligence and precision and strategic clarity were the highest human virtues in a professional context. She'd hired for them, cultivated them, rewarded them. She'd assembled a board that reflected them. And she'd been, not wrong exactly, but incomplete. Because Richard Hale had possessed all of those qualities. He'd been intelligent and precise and strategically clear in the service of something that had no loyalty in it, no actual stake in the thing he was nominally part of. The quality that Logan Mercer had, the thing that had been in the car with her every morning for 14 months without announcing itself, without requiring acknowledgement, without asking for anything, was not intelligence, though he was intelligent. It was not precision, though he was precise. It was something harder to quantify, and therefore easier to discount until the moment it became the only thing that mattered. He cared, not abstractly, not as a professional obligation or a function of training. He cared about the specific people in his specific vicinity, with a consistency that didn't require anything from them in return, that had operated at exactly the same level before she knew who he was and after, before there was a wooden box and a key and a new title on a door and after. The caring was not contingent. It was structural, built into him the way load-bearing elements were built into a building, invisible when the building was standing, essential when anything applied pressure to it. She thought about Carolyn Marsh, who had given her 12 months of time and asked for nothing. She thought about what she'd said to Logan in her office. The people who helped her when she had nothing had never asked for anything back. And she thought about the fact that Logan had been helping her in the most direct and consequential way possible, from the moment he'd gotten out of the Maybach on Michigan Avenue and walked toward a building full of things going wrong. He hadn't asked, she'd been the one to offer. And he'd accepted reluctantly, and only on his terms. And the terms had been about Emma before they were about anything else. This was the lesson that she carried. Not in the abstract. Isabella Sterling had no use for abstract lessons, for the kind of wisdom that lived in quotable sentences and stayed there. The lesson was concrete and specific, and she applied it in the way she applied everything, operationally. She restructured the board with people she had vetted not only for competence but for stake. People who had something real invested in what the company was, not what they could extract from it. She redesigned the executive team's communication protocols with the understanding that information shared on assumed loyalty was not secure, and that security required verification rather than assumption. She built the relationship with the Federal Liaison Office on the Nexus custodianship into a formal quarterly review process, rather than leaving it as a contractual checkbox. And she paid attention, in a way she hadn't before, to the people in her immediate vicinity. Not in the surveilling sense. That was Kowalski's failure made permanent, the error of reducing people to their functions. She paid attention in the more basic sense of actually seeing them. Rachel Kim, who noticed the parking lot camera on day 2. Torres, who ran the lobby security with the specific competence of someone who took ordinary days as seriously as extraordinary ones. The assistant named Diane, who had been with Isabella for 7 years and who managed her schedule with a precision that had always seemed merely excellent and which Isabella now understood to be a form of loyalty that deserved to be named. She named it, one by one, over the months that followed. Not with boxes and keys. That was a specific debt requiring a specific payment. With the simpler and more durable currency of acknowledgement, of seeing people doing the unglamorous work and saying, I see you doing it, and it matters. She was not naturally good at this. She was naturally good at forward momentum, at the next problem, at the horizon, presence. The specific, grounded, backward-looking presence of someone who understood that the current moment had been built by the moments before it, required effort from her. She applied the effort, imperfectly and inconsistently, and with occasional backsliding into the focused tunnel vision that had always been her default mode. And it got a little easier, a little more habitual, over time. Logan noticed this. She could tell from the occasional look he gave her when she said something he hadn't expected, the brief quality of registration that crossed his face before he returned to whatever he'd been doing. He never commented on it. That was consistent with who he was. She mentioned it to him once in the car. Rachel was driving, Logan was in the passenger seat reviewing something on his tablet, and Isabella was in the back, and she said, I've been thinking about what you said at the Harrington, about the choice people make after you hire them. He looked up from the tablet. You said the choice doesn't have anything to do with me, she said. That I hired Kowalski and I couldn't control what he decided to do with the position. I remember. I've been thinking about whether that's entirely true, she said. Not the legal accountability part. I accept that. But the environment. Whether I created conditions that made a certain kind of betrayal more possible. Whether the way I ran things, the assumption of competence over stake, the information structures, the hierarchy, made it easier for someone like Hale to operate. Logan was quiet for a moment. He set the tablet down. Possibly, he said. Probably. He looked out the windshield. Most environments that get exploited have structural vulnerabilities that predate the person who exploits them. That doesn't make the exploiter less responsible. It means the environment was carrying a risk that nobody priced correctly. A pause. The question isn't whether you're responsible for what Hale chose. You're not. The question is whether the environment is better now. Is it? He looked at her. Yes, he said. Considerably. She sat with this. You're not going to tell me it wasn't my fault. It wasn't your fault, he said. I'm also not going to tell you that the conditions were irrelevant because that would be less honest. Most people would choose one or the other. Most people are uncomfortable with both things being true at the same time, he said. But they are. She looked out the window at the city going past. I know, she said. That's why I asked you instead of someone else. The oak tree in the backyard had fully leafed out by May, and Emma had taken to doing her homework at the small table Logan had put on the back porch, which was weather-dependent but which Emma had decided was the preferable arrangement regardless of temperature, a position she held with the conviction of someone for whom outdoor homework was a principled stance rather than a preference. On a Friday evening in late May, Logan came home to find her there with her composition notebook, not the interview notebook, a different one, a newer one with a green cover, writing something that she closed when he came through the back door, not quickly enough to be suspicious, but definitely intentionally. What are you writing? He asked. A story, she said. About what? She considered whether to tell him, with the specific quality of deliberation that meant she'd already decided but was managing the reveal. About a driver, she said, who wasn't really a driver. Logan looked at her. It's fiction, she said. The teacher said we can write about anything. He sat in the other chair and looked at the backyard, where the oak tree was doing what oak trees did in May, making an enormous amount of leaf in the uncomplicated, committed way that trees made things. Without planning, without strategy, just growth. The grass needed mowing. He'd been meaning to do it on Saturday. Emma had offered to help and he'd accepted, knowing that this meant she would mow approximately 1/3 of the yard before deciding she'd done enough, which was fine. In your story, he said, does the driver figure out what he is? Emma thought about this. Eventually, she said, but it takes a while. Because he keeps thinking the thing he used to be is the real him, and the thing he is now is temporary. She paused. But it turns out they're the same person. He just had to catch up to himself. Logan looked at the oak tree. That's a good story, he said. I know, Emma said, without false modesty, opening the green notebook again. I got the idea from somewhere. He sat on the porch with his daughter in the May evening, with the backyard going from late afternoon into the warm particular gold of early summer dusk, and he thought about all of it. The Harrington, the maintenance corridor, the key in its wooden box, the office on 46, Rachel Kim noting the camera rotation, Hale's face across a courtroom he'd never entered, 13 years, 9 with good behavior, the weight of things that couldn't be undone, and the separate weight of things that could be built in their place. He thought about Claire, who had made him promise to come home to Emma. He was home. He had been every night for 6 years and intended to be every night for however many followed. The meaning of home had expanded from the apartment with the yellow bedroom to this house with the backyard and the oak tree and the mysterious crawl space that Emma had fully colonized with pillows and flashlights and books. And the meaning of himself had expanded similarly. Not replaced, not revised, but enlarged. He was the man who made breakfast on Saturday mornings and helped with math homework and picked Emma up every day at 3:30 without exception. He was also the man who had walked into a building when 3 black SUVs moved too slowly down a wet Chicago street, and the man who sat in an office on the 46th floor of a tower on Wacker Drive and built the systems that protected the people inside it. Both. Together. The same person. He thought about the thing Harwick had said on the phone in November. You've known since the night at the hotel, you just haven't let yourself say it, and thought that Harwick had been right, which was also consistent with Harwick's pattern. He thought about what he would say if someone asked him, now, what he was. He'd say, a father, a former SEAL, a man who builds things that protect people, someone who pays attention when nothing is happening because that's when attention matters most. He'd say, I'm someone who walked away from one life because it cost too much and built another one that cost differently, and it turned out that what I carried from the first life was exactly what the second one needed, and I spent longer than I should have figuring that out. He'd say, the people who helped me figure it out, a girl with a green notebook who asks better questions than most adults, and a woman who threw a chair in a hotel dining room and handed me a key in a wooden box. They're not the reason I became who I am. They're the reason I stopped arguing with who I already was. Emma wrote in her notebook in the fading light, and Logan sat beside her in the May evening, and the oak tree made its leaves, and the city went about its enormous and different business beyond the fence, and the backyard was quiet in the specific way of a place where people were living well in the ordinary sense, not free of difficulty, not free of weight, not the sanitized version of fine, but the actual version, which required both hands and didn't come with guarantees and was, in the end, the only kind worth building. He would be in the office on Monday. He would run a protocol review in the morning and a team briefing at noon, and he would eat lunch at his desk and leave at 3 to pick Emma up, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, he would be doing the work that he had spent 6 years pretending to be done with. And he would be doing it correctly, at the right altitude, with both parts of himself in the room. And on Saturday, he would mow the lawn with Emma's assistants covering approximately 1/3 of it. And that was enough. That was, in fact, exactly enough.